Everyone. I'm your narrator, and I'm here to guide you through another story tonight. I know many of you are watching this video to relax or perhaps even to fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Alright, make yourselves comfortable, sit back, and relax. There was an old wooden house perched on a lonely hill, abandoned for decades. By day, it looked like just another forgotten structure, but by night, something about it seemed alive. Its windows, dark and hollow, appeared to shift slightly as if moved by a breeze, though the air always seemed unnervingly still. Inside, faint whispers hummed strange, eerie tunes that no one could decipher. Long shadows stretched and danced along the walls, always just out of reach, always watching, but never letting themselves be seen clearly. People avoided that house. They didn't visit it, and they didn't talk about it, as if silence could erase its unsettling presence. But one night, I decided to go. It was just past midnight when I arrived at the base of the hill. I parked my car on the edge of a dirt road, where wild bushes grew unchecked. There was no wind, no sound of traffic, and no lights, only the faint glow of a pale moon. From there, I could see the house at the top of the hill, a simple, weathered structure made of old wooden planks. The wood looked dry and uneven, with parts of the frame twisted as if struggling to hold itself together. The roof sagged slightly, a silent reminder of the house's age. For a moment, I stayed at the foot of the hill, taking in the scene. My heart was racing, my palms damp with sweat. The scent of damp earth and a strange musty odor hung heavy in the air, filling my nose and tightening my throat. Something about that smell stuck with me, as if it were a warning I didn't yet understand. But I wasn't about to turn back. The grass on the slope was wild and tall, reaching up to my knees. It scratched against my jeans as I made my way up, each step crunching softly in the stillness. The path ahead was barely visible in the darkness, but I kept my flashlight off. I wanted to stay quiet, to listen to the silence, and feel the night around me. All I could hear was the sound of my boots against the ground and the steady rhythm of my breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a flatter patch of ground. The house loomed just 6 meters ahead, its silhouette solid yet haunting. I paused and flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint, loose boards, and missing shingles. The windows were tightly shut, though I'd read stories claiming they rattled on their own during the night. Swallowing my nerves, I approached the front door. The wood was rough and cold under my fingertips. I gripped the handle, and after a moment of hesitation I turned it. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a small, dusty room. The air inside was thick, carrying the smell of old fabric left too long in a damp closet. My nose wrinkled involuntarily. I stepped inside, letting the door close behind me with a soft thud. The floor creaked under my boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. The main room was small and empty, save for a broken chair leaning against one wall. Near one corner, a narrow staircase led upward, its steps warped and uneven. Patches of mold clung to the walls like dark stains, creeping up toward the ceiling. A sudden itch made me scratch the back of my neck. My skin prickled, as though unseen eyes were watching. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to steady my nerves. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, landing on a narrow door that appeared to lead to a kitchen. I cautiously approached and peeked inside. There was an old sink, a table with one leg broken, and in one corner of the room, there was a pile of leaves and twigs, as though an animal had dragged them there. I waited, listening carefully. At first, there was nothing. Then I thought I heard a faint hum, a voice, perhaps, like someone softly humming with their mouth closed. It lasted only a few seconds and then stopped. I strained to locate the source of the sound. Was it coming from above? Raising my flashlight, I tried to steady my trembling hand. My breathing quickened, and my chest felt tight. Hesitantly, I called out, "Hello?" My voice seemed small, swallowed by the emptiness. There was no response. Just silence. I cautiously moved back into the main room and headed towards the stairs. The steps looked fragile, made of thin wooden planks. As I tested the first step, it let out a loud creak, the sound echoing unnervingly through the vacant house. Slowly I ascended, feeling the wood give slightly beneath my weight. At the top, a short hallway stretched out before me. To the left, there was a door that appeared firmly shut. To the right, another door was slightly ajar. A faint, musty odor hung in the air, like old paper left too long in a damp box. On the floorboards, I noticed faint markings, but it was too dark to make out what they were. I shone my flashlight on the wall. The paint was cracked, peeling in jagged patterns. Then I saw shadows. Long, sinuous shapes that moved across the surface, though I wasn't moving the light. I froze. My hands shook as I stared at the shadows sliding like living things. A chill ran down my spine. I had always thought my shifts at the hospital would be uneventful. That night began like any other, calm, with a skeleton staff making the dimly lit hallways feel vast and hollow. Something about the fluorescent lighting gave the place a colder, more sterile atmosphere than it already had. My duties were simple: check on the patients, ensure they were comfortable, and assist the medical staff when needed. But that night, my rounds took me to the oldest wing of the hospital, a section that was no longer in use, save for storage. Some employees avoided that area altogether, whispering about strange occurrences. There were rumors, of course. Tales of shadowy figures lurking in the hallways, lights flickering for no reason, and doors shutting on their own. I never gave those stories much thought, assuming they were just spooky legends meant to scare the newer staff. Around midnight, I was asked to take some supplies to the storage room in the old wing. I grabbed a cart loaded with boxes and pushed open the heavy double doors that led to the section. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The air was colder, heavier, and unsettlingly still. The familiar hum of hospital machinery and the faint murmur of distant voices faded behind me. The hallway ahead was deathly silent. Occasionally, the lights above flickered, casting moving shadows on the tiled walls. The polished floor reflected my distorted figure, giving the impression of something unnatural. Then I heard it, a soft thud, like something falling to the floor in the storage room I had just left. My first thought was that one of the boxes might have toppled over. I sighed, retraced my steps, and reopened the door. The room was exactly as I'd left it. The boxes were stacked neatly, undisturbed. There was nothing out of place. A shiver ran through me as I quickly left, embarrassed by how easily I had been startled. On my way back, however, things began to feel wrong. The lights flickered more frequently, leaving the hallway in unsettling darkness for longer intervals. Each time a light went out, the shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. Halfway down the corridor, I heard footsteps. Not mine. These were slower, heavier, deliberate, like someone following just a few steps behind me. I stopped abruptly. And so did they. I turned around, and the hallway was empty. I turned my head, and there was no one. The hallway stretched out before me, utterly silent except for the flickering shadows cast by the stuttering lights. My heartbeat quickened, and I instinctively quickened my pace. But the sound of footsteps behind me mirrored my movements, speeding up as I did. I took a sharp left at the next hallway, nearly running now. I knew I was being irrational. No one was following me, right? Still, that sensation of being pursued gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Finally, I reached the double doors separating the old wing from the rest of the hospital. Desperate for a reprieve, I pushed against the doors, expecting the comfort of bright lights and bustling noise on the other side. The doors didn't budge. I shoved again, harder this time. Still nothing. Panic rose like bile in my throat. I spun around, hoping to find an explanation or a way out. That's when I saw it, at the other end of the hallway. A figure. It was tall and thin, its features blurred and indistinct under the sporadic light. It stood unnervingly still, its head tilted slightly to the side as if studying me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling and much weaker than I'd intended. The figure didn't respond. I pressed my back against the doors, my hand frantically searching my pocket for the keyring. My fingers fumbled, shaking as they tried to grasp the key that would unlock the doors. The figure began to move, but not in a way that was normal. Its steps were uneven, almost as if it were dragging one leg behind it. My fingers finally found the right key. With a burst of desperation, I jammed it into the lock and turned. The doors opened with a sharp click, and I threw myself through, slamming them shut behind me. I leaned against the doors, gasping for air, as the comforting light and familiar hum of the active hospital wing surrounded me. Slowly, I peeked through the small window on the door. The figure was gone. I made my way back to the nurse's station, my mind racing. I didn't say anything to my coworkers. How could I? I sat there in silence, the weight of what I had seen pressing down on me like a heavy fog. The next day, I confided in a colleague, hoping they'd laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. But instead, their expression darkened. "You're not the first to see something there," they said quietly. "And you won't be the last." That was the last night I ever worked the night shift. I never set foot in that old wing again. But even now, I dream of that figure, still, silent, standing at the end of the hallway, its head tilted as though waiting. I don't know what it was, but I know it's still there. A quiet night that was anything but ordinary. I always thought working night shifts at the hospital would be routine. It was usually calm, too calm, at times. The reduced staff made the vast hallways feel cavernous and eerie, their cold fluorescent lighting amplifying the chill in the air. My tasks were straightforward: check on patients, ensure their comfort, and assist the medical team if needed. That night started like any other, but it quickly became a night I would never forget. My rounds took me to the oldest part of the hospital, a section no longer in use except for storage. Some employees avoided that area, whispering about strange occurrences. Flickering lights, doors slamming shut on their own, and fleeting shadows that danced just out of sight. I dismissed them as silly stories meant to spook newcomers. Around midnight, I was asked to take supplies to the storage room in the old wing. Grabbing a cart loaded with boxes, I pushed through the double doors leading to that section. The air changed immediately. It was colder, denser, as if the space itself carried a weight. The usual background noise of the hospital, the hum of machines, the distant murmur of voices, faded away, leaving an oppressive silence. The flickering lights cast moving shadows that seemed almost alive, and the polished tiles below distorted my reflection with each step. I reached the storage room and unloaded the boxes quickly, eager to return to the well-lit, populated areas. Locking the metal door securely, I turned to leave. Then I heard it. A soft thud, like something falling to the floor in the room I had just left. My first thought was that a box hadn't been properly stacked. With a sigh, I turned back, hesitating just long enough to wonder if I should ignore it. But something compelled me to check. And that decision would haunt me forever. And so, I opened the door again. The room was exactly as I had left it. The boxes were neatly stacked, everything in perfect order. There was nothing on the floor, nothing out of place. I stepped out quickly, feeling slightly foolish for letting myself get scared over something so trivial. As I made my way back, I noticed something strange. The lights in the hallway seemed to flicker more frequently now, and each time a light went out, the corridor felt darker than it should have been. Halfway down the hall, I heard footsteps. But these weren't mine. They were slower, heavier, as if someone, or something, was following me. I froze in place, my heart pounding, and turned my head. The hallway was empty, just an endless stretch of flickering shadows cast by the unstable lights. I forced myself to keep walking, quickening my pace, my heartbeat now thundering in my ears. And then I heard it. The steps behind me matched my own, accelerating as I moved faster. I rounded the corner into the next hallway, now almost running, my breath shallow and ragged. I told myself I was being irrational, that there was no one there, but the sensation of being followed was undeniable. I finally reached the heavy double doors that separated the old wing from the rest of the hospital. Relief flooded me at the thought of crossing into the brightly lit, bustling part of the building. I pushed against the doors, but they didn't budge. Confused, I pushed harder. Still, they wouldn't move. Panic clawed its way into my throat as I turned to look back down the hallway. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure, tall, thin, barely visible under the flickering light. It didn't move. Its head was tilted slightly to one side, as though it was watching me, studying me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling and far weaker than I had intended. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, unnerving. I backed up, pressing myself against the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled in my pocket for the key. My fingers brushed against the keyring, and I grasped for it desperately. The figure began to move. Its steps were uneven, almost dragging one leg as it advanced toward me. My trembling fingers finally found the right key. I jammed it into the lock, turning it with all the force I could muster. The doors gave way with a loud click, and I threw myself through to the other side, slamming them shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for air, my chest heaving, surrounded now by the familiar lights and sounds of the hospital's active wing. I turned to the small window in the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was gone. I returned to the nurse's station, forcing myself to act as if nothing had happened. I didn't say a word to my coworkers, instead sitting silently, the weight of what I had seen pressing heavily on me. The next day, I confided in a colleague, expecting them to laugh or brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. But instead, their expression darkened. "You're not the first to see something there," they said quietly. "And you won't be the last." That was the last night I ever worked the night shift. I never stepped foot in that old wing again. But the memory lingers. I still dream of that figure at the end of the hallway, standing there, head tilted as though it's waiting for something. I don't know what it was, but I know it was there. I was trembling now, my heart racing, but I didn't run. I tried to steady my breathing, to think clearly. Slowly, I approached the door to my right. I nudged it open with my foot, and it creaked, the sound dry and grating. Inside, the room was empty. A single, grimy window overlooked the hill beyond. In one corner, there was a pile of old blankets, damp and forgotten. On the floor near the center of the room, I noticed a dark stain. I moved closer, shining my flashlight on it. The texture was coarse and dry. At first glance, it looked like old mud. But as I leaned in, the uneasy feeling crept back, stronger than ever. The glass pane was cracked. Then I heard a tapping sound near the window. I turned around and noticed the glass trembling slightly, tapping against the frame. Yet, there wasn't even a hint of a breeze. My chest tightened, and beads of sweat formed on my forehead. I wiped them away with my sleeve as I instinctively stepped back into the hallway. I decided to check the other door. It was jammed. I pushed harder, and with a sudden snap, it flew open. Inside the second room, I saw a small dresser. Its drawers were pulled out and completely empty. In one corner of the room sat a chair, stripped of its seat, leaving only its skeletal frame. The window in this room was shut too, but something strange caught my attention. The latch on the window moved, on its own. I froze, my eyes glued to the latch. The light from my flashlight quivered as I tracked its every motion, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. But it didn't move again. Just as I let out a shaky breath, a sound erupted behind me, a low hum. It was the same hum I'd heard earlier. Whipping around, I aimed my flashlight down the hallway, illuminating every shadowy corner. But there was nothing. No one. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stood there, paralyzed. The hum continued, quieter this time, almost like a whisper, a haunting, wordless melody. It seemed to come from downstairs. Gathering my courage, I treaded back through the hallway, careful not to slip on the creaky stairs. Each step groaned under my weight as I descended. Back in the main room, I stopped and held my breath, waiting. The voice, if it was a voice, faded, leaving behind only a faint sound, like fabric brushing against wood. I turned toward the kitchen, moving cautiously, the flashlight beam leading the way. As I rounded the broken table and scattered leaves, my eyes locked onto the back door. It was handleless, secured with loose wooden planks nailed haphazardly. I reached for one and tried to pull it free, but it wouldn't budge. Then, to my left, I heard it, a soft dragging noise. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, my pulse racing. But there was nothing, just a wall lined with broken shelves. My mouth was dry, and my stomach churned with unease. My legs felt tense, ready to bolt, but my mind pushed me forward. The air seemed denser now, harder to breathe. Every small inhale felt like a monumental effort, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn around and run. But something held me there, a mix of defiance and a desperate need to understand. "There's no such thing as ghosts," I muttered to myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the weight of what I was experiencing. Back in the main room, I lingered near the staircase. My flashlight swept across the walls, and that's when I saw them again, those shadows. They stretched and morphed across the surface, shifting shapes as if alive, never settling into a distinct form. I moved the flashlight, trying to debunk it as a trick of the light, but the shadows didn't align with anything in the room. They grew and shrank, elongating unnaturally. My throat felt tight, and a cold sweat trickled between my shoulder blades. Then the hum returned. This time, it was dangerously close, so close it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, my heart pounding like a drum. But again, there was no one there. Reaching out with my free hand, I felt the empty air behind me. It was just that, empty. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I repeated the question louder. "Who's here?" Nothing. My hand holding the flashlight was shaking violently now, and my knees threatened to give out beneath me. I crouched, steadying myself with one hand on the floor. The wooden planks felt rough and dry beneath my palm. I took a moment to gather myself, focusing on my breathing. Slowly, I rose and decided to check upstairs again. Maybe I had missed something the first time, but climbing the stairs for the second time felt like scaling a mountain. My legs trembled with every step. At the top, I stood in the hallway, surrounded by an oppressive silence. I revisited the first room. The pile of blankets in the corner remained untouched. I approached them cautiously, the flashlight beam revealing their tattered, musty fabric. Gently, I prodded the pile with the tip of my boot, releasing a cloud of dust. There was nothing underneath. As I turned back toward the hallway, a familiar sound reached my ears. The window, once again, began to rattle. I approached it, flashlight in hand. I pressed my hand against the glass. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, despite the lack of wind outside. The moon hid behind a cluster of thick clouds, leaving the room even darker than before. Moving cautiously, I stepped into the next room. I checked the dresser, empty. Just an empty void and the faint smell of old wood. In the corner, a chair creaked softly. Startled, I directed my flashlight toward it. It didn't move. Slowly, I reached out and placed my hand on the backrest. Solid. Firm. I let it go and took a step back, my pulse quickening. I strained to hear that strange humming sound again, but there was only silence. Descending the stairs carefully and slowly, I stayed close to the door at the bottom. I wanted to remember everything I had seen, the trembling windows, the shifting shadows, the strange voices humming in unison, and the dirt that had appeared from nowhere. None of it made sense. My head throbbed, my stomach churned, and my neck felt stiff as if I were carrying an invisible weight. Before leaving, I stood in the center of the main room one last time. I listened, every nerve in my body alert. Then, as if in a trance, I moved toward the small opening in the tent. Through the slit, I watched them. They moved around the car, slow and deliberate, like predators circling prey. One leaned down, inspecting the driver's door. I heard a faint scraping sound that sent a jolt through me. Another approached and tested the door handle, jiggling it gently but persistently. I knew the doors were locked, but their determination gnawed at my confidence. My hand slid into my backpack, searching for the knife. It was small, a folding knife, not much use against multiple people, but at least it was something. The cold metal in my hand offered a sliver of control, a fragile sense of security. I thought about making a noise, shouting to scare them off. Would they scatter? Or would they come straight for me? I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe they were locals curious about the car. Or perhaps they were looking for something to steal and had stumbled upon my campsite by chance. My heart pounded relentlessly, my breath shallow. My stomach tightened as if twisted into knots. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry as sandpaper. I rubbed my face with my free hand, fighting to stay calm. I needed more information, something to understand their intentions. Slowly, I leaned forward, pressing my ear against the opening of the tent. The ground beneath my elbows was icy, and the cool night air stung my face, bringing tears to my eyes. I listened intently, straining to catch even fragments of their conversation. Words drifted to me in broken pieces, something about under the seat, and check the trunk. Their voices were low, rough, and indistinct. I couldn't tell their ages or pinpoint their accents. Were they locals? Or from somewhere far away? They continued whispering, pausing whenever one of them made a noise, then resuming their quiet dialogue. Their movements were deliberate, unhurried but purposeful. I waited another minute, but it was clear they weren't leaving. If they managed to get into the car, they'd find everything: my clothes, my phone charger, my map. Losing the car would mean being stranded. I had no signal on my phone, and I hadn't seen another soul for miles. Slowly, I zipped the tent back up, careful not to make a sound. Inside the suffocating darkness of the tent, I took a deep breath. I slipped the knife into the pocket of my jacket, zipping it up to ensure I wouldn't lose it. Grasping my flashlight tightly, I kept my finger poised over the switch. If I was going to confront them, I needed every advantage I could muster. The light might startle them, give me a few precious seconds. Maybe I could shout, try to sound confident, make them believe I wasn't afraid. But deep down, I knew the truth. My heart pounded against my ribs like a drum. My palms were slick with sweat, my mind racing. I wasn't ready for what might come next. But I had no choice. Let me set the scene for you. A remote camping spot, the kind of place where silence reigns and the night feels eternal. I had picked this secluded area, far from the clamor of the world, hoping for a peaceful retreat. My car was parked just a short distance away, and after turning off the engine, I had slipped into my sleeping bag inside my small tent. The stillness was almost eerie, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves swayed by a gentle breeze. That tranquility had lulled me to sleep. But now, I was wide awake, and something was wrong. I heard voices. Low, hushed whispers floated through the stillness, pulling me from the haze of sleep. My groggy mind struggled to process what I was hearing. These weren't the sounds of nocturnal animals or the wind. These were human voices, coming from close, too close. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Straining to pinpoint the source, I turned my head toward the entrance of the tent. The whispers were near my car, fragmented sentences interrupted by brief silences. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest as I lay motionless, sweat forming on my forehead, under my arms, and in the palms of my hands. Who were these people? What did they want? From inside the tent, I could see nothing. The material was too thin to block my rising anxiety, but too thick to reveal the intruders. My options raced through my mind. Next to my sleeping bag was a flashlight. In my backpack, a folding knife. The car keys were in my jacket pocket. If they were near the car, they could already be tampering with it. I needed to act. Moving as quietly as I could, I reached for the zipper of the tent. Slowly, carefully, I began to open it, just enough to peek outside. The sound of the zipper seemed deafening in the quiet night. I froze. The whispers stopped. My heart raced. The night air brushed against my face, cold and biting. Every instinct screamed for me to stay hidden, but I knew time was running out. If they discovered me, I would lose any element of surprise. Taking a deep breath, I unzipped the tent in one swift motion and stepped out, flashlight in hand. I aimed the beam directly toward the car. The bright light cut through the darkness, illuminating shadowy figures. They recoiled, raising their hands to shield their faces from the sudden glare. There were 5 of them, all dressed in hooded jackets, their faces partially obscured. Dirt and grime covered them, as if they had been outdoors for days. None of them spoke, but their stillness was unnerving. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. It wavered, betraying my fear. They didn't answer. One of them, taller than the rest, raised a hand to block the light. I caught a glimpse of his jawline under the hood, but little else. He didn't move toward me. Another took a small step back. The others remained motionless. Gripping the flashlight with both hands to steady my trembling, I took a cautious step forward, keeping a safe distance. "Stay away from my car!" I shouted, my voice firmer this time. The tall one turned his head slightly, as if signaling to the others. I couldn't read their expressions, and they made no sudden moves. They just stood there, silent and unyielding. A creeping dread washed over me as I wondered if they had a plan. And then, just like that, I woke up. My heart was pounding, and I opened my eyes to the familiar sight of my small tent. The memory of the dream clung to me like a shadow, but the whispers I had heard were real. Voices drifted from somewhere outside the tent, near the car. I lay still, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the situation. The whispers came in broken phrases, punctuated by stretches of silence. Whoever they were close, too close. My flashlight was within reach. My knife was in my bag. My car keys in my jacket pocket. I needed to see what was happening. Slowly, I reached for the zipper again. The faint metallic sound seemed deafening in the quiet of the night. And then, just as before, the whispers stopped. The air was damp, carrying the smell of wet grass and soil, and it filled my nostrils. After a few moments of silence, the voices returned, but this time, they were softer, almost as if they were trying to stay hidden. Carefully, I unzipped the tent just an inch more and peeked outside. My car was parked about 5 meters away, tucked behind some bushes to keep it out of sight from the road. But now, I saw silhouettes around it, 4 or maybe 5 figures crouched, moving slowly and deliberately. They were circling the car, touching the doors, peering through the windows, and pressing their faces against the glass. There were no lights, no phone screens, no flashlights, just their dark forms against the faint glow of the starlit sky. I couldn't make out their faces. They were dressed in dark clothing, maybe hooded jackets, and their hushed voices reached my ears again. I couldn't understand the words, but they seemed to be discussing something about the car. Soft tapping noises followed, like they were testing the door handles. My throat felt dry, my pulse quickening. Turning on a light might scare them off, or it could draw their attention straight to me. I stayed still, holding my breath, considering my options. Were they trying to break into my car? I needed to act, but I was alone, and they outnumbered me. I thought about slipping out from the back of the tent to sneak around them, but there was no rear exit, just a zipper. If I tried to escape that way, the noise could give me away, and I had no idea how they'd react. For now, I stayed put, breathing slowly, feeling my chest rise and fall. The cold air brushed against my skin, amplifying the tension. I listened closely. Their voices remained steady, but the words were still indistinct, low murmurs, conspiratorial. I wondered if they knew I was there. Did they assume the car was abandoned? Maybe they thought no one was nearby. My campsite was minimal, just my tent, a small fire pit I had dug earlier, and my car. No chairs, no table, nothing that screamed, "Someone's here." The tent was low to the ground, positioned beneath a tree, blending into the darkness. It could easily be overlooked. The idea of staying silent and waiting for them to leave felt like a gamble. What if they tried to break in or damage something? I couldn't risk it. That car was my only way out, my lifeline in the middle of nowhere. Without it, I'd be stranded. For a moment, I considered calling out to them, asking what they wanted. But fear gripped me. What if that made things worse? I didn't know if they were armed or if they were looking for trouble. Instead, I decided to watch them, hoping they'd leave on their own. My breathing was heavy, my throat tight. My eyes stayed fixed on them as I held my flashlight in a trembling grip, its beam illuminating their figures. They were motionless now, as if weighing their next move. The tallest one tilted his head slightly, as though signaling something. Then, slowly, one of them stepped back into the nearby bushes. Another followed. One by one, they began retreating, moving cautiously but always glancing in my direction. The tallest figure lingered, standing still for a few moments more. His hand rose, shielding his face from the faint light. Finally, he backed away, never breaking eye contact, until he, too, disappeared into the shadows, following the others. I watched them vanish behind the bushes, the crunch of leaves underfoot marking their departure. And soft footsteps on the earth again. Silence enveloped me as I stood still, holding the flashlight in front of me. My hand trembled uncontrollably, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. Slowly, I turned, scanning the area with the beam of light. Nothing. Not a single movement. Cautiously, I walked toward my car, every sense heightened. I checked the doors. They were all still locked. Then I inspected the windows. None were shattered. The flashlight illuminated the paint and handles. There were scratches, but nothing significant. I tested the trunk. It remained closed, and the tires appeared intact. Leaning forward, I shone the flashlight into the car's interior, focusing on the back seat. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I exhaled deeply, took a step back, and rubbed the back of my neck, trying to shake the tension. My eyes darted toward the bushes where the figures had disappeared moments ago. Darkness. Only the tall, imposing trees stood there now. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying there until sunrise. Sleep was out of the question. The mere thought that they might return sent chills racing through me. Without hesitation, I entered the tent and hastily packed my belongings. My sleeping bag went into its sack before I shoved it into the car. My backpack, jacket, and the few items I had unpacked were tossed onto the back seat with little care. I didn't bother dismantling the tent properly. Instead, I shook off the dirt and crammed it into the trunk. For a brief moment, I glanced around the clearing one last time. The silence felt unnervingly heavy, like it was hiding something sinister. The stillness was far from comforting. I didn't trust it. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. The hum of the motor brought a small sense of relief, like a fragile thread of normalcy pulling me out of the nightmare. My headlights cut through the night as I directed them toward the area where the figures had been. Nothing. No movement, no shadows. I maneuvered out of the clearing and onto the dirt road, being careful not to skid on the loose gravel. My mind raced, replaying every moment of what had just happened. The silence of those strangers was haunting. Not a single word. They had simply tried to get into the car, then vanished when I appeared. Even as I drove, my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them behind me. But there was nothing, no lights, no vehicles, just the vast emptiness of the dark night and the unsettling feeling of isolation. Gradually, my breathing slowed. The tightness in my chest began to ease, though my hands still shook on the steering wheel. I reached for the radio, hoping for music to break the oppressive silence, but found only static. Frustrated, I turned it off and focused on the road ahead. My plan was simple: drive until I found a safe place. A truck stop, a gas station, anywhere with lights and people. As I drove, questions circled in my mind. What did those figures want? Were they trying to steal something? Were they planning to strip the car for parts? I would never know. What mattered was that I had gotten away. Relief washed over me as I realized how much worse things could have been. They hadn't attacked me, and I hadn't been forced to defend myself physically. My quick reaction with the flashlight and the firmness in my voice had been enough to deter them. As the distance between me and that place grew, the tension in my body began to fade. But the memory lingered, etched into my mind, raw and vivid. Eventually, I reached a crossroads where a sign pointed to a small town, 20 kilometers away. Without hesitation, I decided to drive straight there, hoping to find a well-lit parking lot where I could rest, even if it meant staying inside the car. Setting up the tent again wasn't an option. I couldn't face another night of uncertainty in the open. All I wanted was a place where I could feel safe. Later, I found myself in a modest motel room. The television murmured softly in the background, local news blending with the hum of the air conditioner. Yet, even in this relative comfort, I felt trapped by an unshakable paranoia. I got up from the bed, pacing back and forth, the weight of the night still pressing heavily on my mind. I pulled the curtains tighter, ensuring not a single gap remained through which anyone could peek in from outside. I double-checked the door lock and even placed the desk chair against it, an instinctive move that offered little real security but gave me a fragile sense of control. I approached the small table by the window and sat down, staring at the water bottle I'd bought at the gas station. My mind couldn't stop replaying the events of the last 24 hours. The memory of those figures surrounding my car, their silent, calculated movements, and those incomprehensible whispers, still haunted me. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something felt undeniably off. I picked up my phone to distract myself. The signal was weak but enough to search for information. Random phrases poured into the search bar. Strange people in the woods, nighttime encounters, mysterious whispers. The stories I found ranged from paranormal theories to mundane encounters with drifters. But none of it seemed to align with what I'd experienced. Frustrated, I closed the browser and set the phone aside. The clock read 9:30 p.m., but the emotional exhaustion made it feel like 3 a.m. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts drift. That's when I heard it, a soft, persistent noise. A scratching sound against a hard surface. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Grabbing the remote, I turned off the TV to listen more closely. The sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. I held my breath, feeling every thud of my heartbeat reverberating in my ears. The only other sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. It's probably something outside, I thought, trying to calm myself. Perhaps the wind brushing a branch against the window, or an animal rummaging near the motel's trash bins. But this noise, it was different. It didn't sound natural. It was deliberate, like someone trying to be careful not to draw too much attention. I approached the window cautiously and lifted the curtains slightly to peek outside. The parking lot was dimly lit by a few tall lamps. My car was still there, untouched. I saw no one near it or in the surrounding area. Letting the curtain fall, I leaned against the wall, debating what to do if I heard the sound again. Should I call the front desk? The police? But what if it was just my imagination? I didn't want to come across as paranoid. And then I heard it, a faint knock on the door. I froze, my gaze locking onto the chair I'd placed as an additional barrier. The knock came again, this time slightly louder but not enough to feel threatening. It was almost testing, as though someone wanted to see if I would respond. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling more than I wanted to admit. Silence. No answer. I moved toward the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there. I waited a few seconds before speaking again, this time with more authority. "If someone's out there, I'm calling the police." The moment I finished, I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the hall. Rushing to the window, I pulled the curtain back slightly and caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing around the back of the motel. The details were too blurry to make out, but my chest tightened. Was this just a coincidence? Someone knocking on the wrong door? Or was it connected to the events of the previous night? I didn't want to stay to find out. Grabbing my belongings, I turned off the lights and made my way to my car. Within minutes, I checked for any damage or signs of tampering. Nothing. Everything seemed fine. I started the engine and I slammed the curtain shut with more force, making sure there wasn't even the slightest gap through which someone could see from the outside. I checked the door lock again, even went as far as placing the office chair against it, an instinctive move that didn't offer much real security, but somehow, it made me feel a little better. I walked over to the small table by the window and sat down, staring at the bottle of water I had bought at the gas station. My mind kept replaying the events of the past 24 hours, the terrifying memory of those figures surrounding my car, their movements silent yet calculated, and the incomprehensible whispers still lurking in my mind. No matter how hard I tried to rationalize, something just didn't add up. I decided to check my phone. The signal was weak, but just enough to search for some information. I typed random words into the search bar. Strange people in the forest, nighttime encounters, mysterious whispers. The stories I found ranged from paranormal theories to simple accounts of uncomfortable encounters with homeless people. Nothing I read seemed to fit what I had experienced. Frustrated, I closed the browser and set my phone aside. The clock showed it was 9:30 p.m., but the emotional exhaustion made it feel like it was 3 in the morning. I lay down on the bed again, staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts drift. And then I heard something, a soft, persistent scratching sound against a hard surface. I sat up quickly, my heart racing again. I grabbed the remote control and turned off the TV to hear better. The sound continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting. I could feel every beat of my heart thumping in my ears. There was no other noise, just the hum of the air conditioning. It must be something outside, I thought, trying to calm myself. Maybe the wind was blowing a branch against the window, or perhaps some animal was rummaging through the trash near the motel. But there was something strange about the sound. It wasn't natural. It was as if someone was being careful, trying not to make too much noise, as if they didn't want to draw attention. I slowly approached the window, lifting the curtain slightly to peek outside. The parking lot was lit by a couple of tall lamps, and my car was there, untouched. I didn't see anyone around it or anywhere nearby. I let go of the curtain and leaned against the wall, thinking about what I would do if I heard the noise again. Maybe I should call the front desk or even the police. But what if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me? I didn't want to look paranoid. Then I heard another sound. This time, it was a soft knock on the door. I froze, my eyes darting to the chair I had placed as an extra barricade. The knock came again, a little louder, but still not enough to be a direct threat. It was more like someone testing to see if I would respond. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling more than I wanted to admit. There was no answer. I slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. I didn't see anyone. I waited a few more seconds before speaking again, this time with more conviction. "If someone's there, I'm calling the police." Just as I finished the sentence, I heard hurried footsteps fading away. I rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain a bit. I caught a glimpse of a figure quickly moving toward the back of the motel, but I couldn't make out any details. My chest tightened again. Was it just a coincidence, someone who had gotten the wrong room, or was it something more connected to the events from the previous night? I didn't want to stay and find out. I grabbed my things, turned off the lights, and headed to my car. In a matter of minutes, I checked to make sure there was no damage or signs that someone had tried to break into it. I started the engine. I drove out of the parking lot, heading toward the main road without looking back, as the motel lights disappeared in the rearview mirror. A chilling sensation crawled over me, as if something dark and invisible was still clinging to my presence. I kept driving, searching for a place where I could finally feel truly safe. Though doubt crept in, and I began questioning if such a place even existed. I moved into the old house on a Monday afternoon. I spent most of the day unloading boxes, arranging furniture, and exploring every corner of a place that seemed abandoned by time itself. The windows were stiff, and the wooden floors creaked underfoot as I walked through. I chose it because it was cheap, spacious, and in a quiet location. On my first day, I tried to settle in, but by dusk, I decided to check out the attic. It was a space I accessed via a retractable ladder in the hallway. I climbed slowly, holding a flashlight, and the air in the attic felt stale. It smelled of dust and old wood. Among the shadows, I found an old leather suitcase, worn and with a rusted lock. When I shook it, something inside moved. I carried it down to the dining room and spent several minutes trying to open it with a screwdriver and a thin wire. Finally, I managed to pry it open. Inside were old clothes, shirts, pants, a jacket, and on top of everything, a bundle of letters tied with string. The first letter I opened was dated September 1975, but it described in detail how I had arrived at the house that very morning. It talked about how I had parked my truck, unloaded the boxes, and even tripped over one at the entrance. I opened another letter. This one described, in detail, how I sat at the dining table wearing a dark green t-shirt, trying to open a suitcase I had found in the attic. The date was even older, January 1970. The following letters described details of my life before I moved in, how I spent weekends fixing up an old car in my previous home. They even mentioned a scar on my left arm that I had gotten years ago. They were all dated long before I was even born. My mind desperately sought a logical explanation. Was this some elaborate prank, a trick? But the paper and ink looked genuinely old, and the details were far too specific. I tried to resist what the letters were telling me, but when one mentioned that I would place the clothes from the suitcase on the bed, I refused. Yet, after a while, I did it anyway. 2 shirts, a jacket, 2 pairs of pants, and a tie with an ink stain on the edge, just like the letter said. The pattern was always the same. The letters described what I would do, even when I tried not to. Everything that was happening had already been written. By evening, one letter said that I would return the suitcase to the attic and lock it away there. I refused adamantly. I left the suitcase under my bed. However, around midnight, an unbearable unease forced me to take it back up to the attic. I placed it behind a box, locked the latch, and went back downstairs, angry with myself for following the instructions from those letters. The next morning, the letters were still on the table. The last one said I would find another note inside the suitcase if I went back to the attic. I tried to ignore it, but after breakfast, I went back up again. Inside the suitcase was a new note, without a date. It said I would spend days obsessing over the letters, trying to resist them, but I would always return to the attic. I tried to burn one of the letters. I did it over the kitchen sink, but when I checked the others, one letter described that exact action, how I would do it, with frustration and a growing sense of inevitability. Eventually, fear took over. I locked the letters in a drawer with a padlock, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy, but peace never lasted long. Every night, the creaks of the house and the constant whispering in my mind pulled me back to the letters and the attic. The notes predicted every one of my actions, and no matter how hard I tried to defy their control, I always ended up doing exactly what they said. One morning, while going through my suitcase, I found a new letter. It said that I would eventually accept that I could not escape this house or its messages. It stated that I would continue searching for answers but would never find them. I spent days trying to ignore the letters, but the tension in my chest, the whispers, and the feeling of being watched consumed me. The house was silent, but it never really felt empty. The road stretched endlessly before me, lined with dark trees and blurred silhouettes under the moonlight. The night was heavy, and fear lingered, like a shadow that refused to vanish. I didn't know exactly where I was going. My only goal was to keep moving, far away from anything that could be connected to what I had experienced. After a few hours of driving, I came across an open gas station. The place was small, with a couple of flickering lights illuminating the empty parking lot. I pulled up next to one of the pumps and turned off the engine. I got out of the car and took a deep breath of the cold air. I looked around. There were no signs of life, except for an employee reading a magazine behind the counter inside the station store. I decided to go in, more for the feeling of being surrounded by four walls than out of any real necessity. The interior was gloomy, with half-empty shelves and a faint smell of cleaning products. I grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter. "Long night?" said the employee without looking up from his magazine. "Something like that," I replied, trying to sound casual. The man nodded, seemingly accustomed to the stories of late-night travelers. I paid and quickly left, feeling more nervous than when I had first entered. Back in the car, I started the engine and sat there, staring through the windshield. Dew began to form on the glass, reflecting the lights of the station like tiny stars. I wondered if I should continue driving or find somewhere to rest, but the thought of staying in one place unsettled me. I had the constant feeling that someone, or something, was still searching for me. While lost in my thoughts, a movement in the rearview mirror caught my attention. I quickly turned my head, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The parking lot was still empty, the shadows motionless. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, a product of exhaustion and nerves. I decided to press on. The road was quieter now, with less traffic than before. The miles passed slowly, and the landscape barely changed, trees, hills, and a sky growing more overcast as I went on. As I drove, I began to notice something strange. My gas tank, which I had just filled completely at the station, seemed to be draining faster than usual. I checked the gauge several times, sure that something was wrong. A few minutes later, the engine began to make a strange noise, a rhythmic knocking sound I hadn't heard before. My chest tightened once again, and I knew something was off. A cold sweat covered my forehead as I looked at the dashboard, but there were no warning lights on. Despite that, I could feel the car losing power slowly. Finally, I found myself forced to pull over to the side of the road. I turned off the engine and sat in silence, listening to the wind blowing weakly through the nearby trees. I turned on my phone's flashlight and got out of the car. I looked under the hood. Even though I didn't know much about mechanics, everything seemed to be in place, but the engine refused to start again. The silence around me was unnerving, broken only by the soft whisper of leaves stirred by the wind. I looked at the empty road, hoping a car would pass by, but there was no one. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The feeling of being trapped grew rapidly. I glanced at the trees that lined the road. Their shadows seemed deeper under the weak light of the moon, as if they were hiding something that didn't want to be seen. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a soft crackling, like footsteps in the brush. I turned the flashlight toward the source of the noise but saw nothing. My breathing quickened, and my heart began to pound in my ears. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. I decided to go back to the car and lock the doors. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel firmly, and waited. The crackling came again, closer this time. I pointed the flashlight toward the windshield, but the light revealed nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. That's when I heard it again. My name, whispered, just like the night before. But this time, it was much clearer. My muscles tensed. I looked around frantically, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one. The sound repeated, and this time, it seemed to come from inside the car. A chill ran through my entire body. I turned the flashlight toward the back seats, my heart pounding in my chest. The light illuminated the empty space, but the sense of a presence lingered. For the first time in a long while, I considered, though I wasn't religious, the possibility that something was there. The whisper faded slowly, leaving only the sound of my own heavy breathing. I stayed there for what seemed like hours, my body stiff and the flashlight still pointing backward. Finally, the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees. I felt something change in the air, as if a heavy pressure was lifting. I started the engine, and this time, it roared to life without issue. Without looking back, I drove onto the road, not stopping until the sun was completely above the horizon. I knew I couldn't explain what had happened, but one thing was clear: that whisper, that presence, was not something I ever wanted to face again. When I reached the next town, I decided it was time to leave the road behind for good. It didn't matter where I was headed, as long as it was far away from the echoes of that night. One afternoon, I decided to leave the house, seeking some clarity. I walked along the gravel road toward the nearest house, a structure old and weathered by time. I knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer. I looked at the windows. The curtains were drawn. I returned to my house with the sun high, but the heat did nothing to dispel the chill I felt as I entered. The air inside seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I decided to ignore the letters and I completely closed the suitcase, and then I shut the drawer where the letters were kept, making sure everything was in place. But inside I felt empty, as if my actions held no real weight. The house remained in silence, but a subtle kind of pressure seemed to fill every corner. At night, the silence grew even worse. Although the letters were locked away and the suitcase was sealed in the attic, I could still feel their presence, as though they were calling to me from the dark corners of the house. One night, while I was trying to sleep on the living room couch, I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the attic. My eyes snapped open. I tried to convince myself that it was just the sound of an old house settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The creaking repeated itself. My chest tightened. Slowly, I got up and turned on the lamp next to the couch. The light was weak, barely strong enough to dispel the shadows that had gathered in the corners. I walked toward the hallway. The access to the attic was right above me. I stood there, staring at the wooden door in the ceiling. I didn't hear anything more, but the sensation of being watched intensified. "I'm not going up," I whispered to myself, as though saying those words could solidify my decision. But something inside me knew it was only a matter of time. The next day, I tried to push any thoughts of the attic or the letters out of my mind. I went out into the backyard and decided to trim the overgrown weeds. As I worked under the sun, I felt a slight relief. The cool air helped clear my head. Later, when I returned to the house, sweating and exhausted, I showered and sat down for a simple dinner. For a moment, I let myself believe that I was regaining control of my life. But just as I began to relax, a faint whisper made me glance toward the hallway. It sounded like a distant murmur, barely audible but unmistakable. My whole body tensed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to ignore it. Minutes later, I heard a soft tapping. The sound was coming from the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly ascended the retractable stairs, feeling the weight of every step. I opened the door carefully and peered inside. The suitcase was open. The air in the attic was colder than I remembered. I walked closer to the suitcase and saw the letters scattered out, arranged in a circle around a small folded piece of paper in the center. My hand shook as I picked up the paper and unfolded it. It read, "You know you can't resist. You'll keep searching. You'll keep coming back. This is your place now." I felt my legs weaken. I dropped the note and ran down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands were covered in sweat. That night I couldn't sleep. The words from the note echoed in my head, blending with the whispers that never seemed to stop. I realized something terrifying. I could no longer tell if the house was under the control of the letters, or if I was. Days passed, but the nights always returned, repeating the same cycle of unease and whispers. I tried to stay busy during the day, organizing what little I had left to unpack or making small repairs around the house, all to avoid thinking about what was happening in the attic. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the living room bookshelf, I found a black-covered notebook that I didn't remember seeing before. I opened it. The first page was blank, but the following ones contained handwriting I instantly recognized, the same handwriting I had seen in the letters. My chest tightened. The words in the notebook didn't describe the past. They were predictions, detailing what I would do that very night. It said that I would try to break the cycle again, that I would try to destroy the suitcase or the letters, and in the end, I would fail. "You'll return to the attic," I read in one of the final lines. "You always return." I felt the air grow heavier. I slammed the notebook shut. I threw it on the dining table, not wanting to read anymore. I tried to continue with my tasks. I washed the dishes, checked the cupboards, even swept the floor. But the notebook seemed to be constantly in my peripheral vision, as though calling to me without words. Finally, I opened it again. With trembling hands, I read the next pages. They said I wouldn't resist. They said I would open the suitcase again before the night was over. They said I would find something new inside. I wanted to prove the notebook wrong. I left the house and wandered aimlessly down the road. I could feel the warmth of the sun on my skin, but it didn't reach my mind. It was still tangled in the predictions. When I came back, the sun had already set. The house was shrouded in shadows, and as I entered, an immediate chill ran through me. The lights seemed dimmer, and the silence was almost deafening. I stood in the living room, staring down the hallway where the attic entrance was. My feet felt rooted to the floor, but my mind was filled with images of the suitcase, the letters, and the notebook. Without realizing it, I found myself climbing the attic stairs. The lantern in my hand was shaking. I pushed open the door and saw that the suitcase was still open. Inside there was something new, a black and white photograph. I picked it up. It showed a figure standing in front of the house. The person had their back to the camera, wearing clothes that seemed to be from the 1950s. In the corner of the photo was a date, March 1962. My heart raced. I felt as though someone was standing right behind me, watching me. I spun around quickly, but the attic was empty. I ran down the stairs, the photo clutched in my hand, and slammed the attic door shut harder than I meant to. That night, I decided to do something drastic. I took all the letters in the photo and threw them into the fireplace. I lit the fire and watched as the flames consumed the paper. The smell of smoke filled the room, but I didn't feel any relief. When the ashes cooled, I sat in front of the extinguished fire, trying to convince myself that it was finally over. But even as I repeated those words to myself, I heard a faint creak from above, followed by a distant whisper. I went to bed, feeling as though I had accomplished nothing. I closed my eyes, but every time I started to drift off, I saw the figure from the photo, standing in front of the house, always with its back to me, motionless. At dawn, I checked the drawer where I had stored the letters. They were still there, intact, as if I had never burned them. I stood frozen in the hallway, my eyes fixed on the house. Every part of me wanted to run, but my feet were nailed to the ground. It was impossible that what I was seeing was real. Through the illuminated window, I saw myself sitting at the table with the letters in front of me. The air felt colder, as if something invisible was absorbing all the warmth around me. My chest tightened, and my breath became shallow. I decided to move closer. As I walked toward the house, my steps echoed on the gravel path, though the sound seemed muffled, as if the world was wrapping itself in an artificial silence. When I reached the porch, the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. "This isn't real," I murmured, but my trembling hand pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly. The inside was identical to how I had left it, the same table, the same letters, the same suitcase on the floor. But the most unsettling thing was the figure sitting at the table. It was me. My head was bent over the letters, as if I were reading, but my face was hidden in shadows. My heart raced as I stepped forward, unable to look away. "Who are you?" I asked in a whisper. The figure slowly lifted its head. The face wasn't exactly mine. It was like an incomplete version, with vague, blurry features, as if someone was trying to remember what I looked like but couldn't. "Everything returns to the beginning," it said, its voice a mixture of mine and something else, something much deeper and older. I took a step back, but my back hit the door that had closed behind me. The figure stood up, moving unnaturally, as if its joints were stiff. It began walking toward me, each step echoing strangely, like it was walking on hollow ground. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice breaking. The figure stopped a few feet away and pointed toward the attic. "Go on," it said, and its voice rumbled in my head like distant thunder. Despite my terror, my feet began to move. I felt like I had no control over my body. I climbed the stairs to the attic, the air growing thicker with each step. When I reached the attic door, it was already open. A flickering light spilled out, as if a candle inside was struggling to stay lit. I entered slowly. In the center of the attic was the mirror I had found earlier, but now it was much larger, almost the size of a door. The glass didn't reflect the room. Instead, it showed the same strange dark world I had seen before. The figures inside the mirror were closer now, so close I could see the details of their elongated forms. The grotesque figures, some with their heads tilted, others stretching their arms toward the glass, crossed. A voice behind me said. I turned and saw a blurry figure resembling myself, standing in the attic doorway. It had no eyes, just deep shadows where they should have been. "I won't do it," I answered, my voice firmer than I expected. The figure didn't move. It simply raised a hand and pointed at the mirror. Once again, I felt a pull in my chest, as though something were pushing me toward the glass. I tried to resist, but my legs moved on their own, slowly stepping toward the mirror. When I was just a few steps away, the figures on the other side began to move frantically, pounding the glass with force. A sharp sound filled the room, like a contained scream, and I felt my head was about to explode. My hand touched the glass. It was cold, but not solid. My skin began to sink into the surface, as if the glass were icy water. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't move. The figure behind me spoke one last time. "Everything goes back to the beginning." In that moment, the world around me crumbled. I woke up in the dining room, my head resting on the table, cards spread out before me. Outside, the sun was rising, and birds were singing, as if nothing had happened. I looked around the room. Everything seemed normal. The suitcase was closed in the corner, and the attic was silent. But I knew I hadn't escaped. The words still echoed in my mind. Everything goes back to the beginning. I slowly stood up, picked up the cards, and put them in the locked drawer. I closed the drawer, but the echo of those steps in the attic still haunted me. I knew the cycle hadn't ended. The phrase, "everything goes back to the beginning," kept echoing in my mind as I leaned against the basement door. My breathing was rapid and shallow, and every shadow in the room seemed deeper than usual. It felt as if the house were alive, watching me from every corner. I decided to stay in the living room, where I could see all the doors and windows. I sat on the couch, a flashlight in one hand, a hammer in the other. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I was certain something else was about to happen. Hours passed slowly. Outside, the night was silent, and inside, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. But just as I began to relax, I heard soft footsteps coming from the hallway. I froze. The steps were light, like someone walking cautiously barefoot. They came from the hallway leading to the attic. I stood up, gripping the hammer tightly. My flashlight illuminated the empty hallway, but the footsteps continued, rhythmic and getting closer. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the footsteps stopped. I took a step toward the hallway, my legs shaking. I checked every door, making sure they were locked. The attic access was still shut, but the air around me felt colder. Then I heard it again. "Everything goes back to the beginning." This time, it was a low whisper, just behind me. I spun around quickly, but no one was there. I decided I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I went up to my room, grabbed a backpack, and started packing essentials: clothes, my phone, charger, and car keys. I didn't have a specific plan, just wanted to get as far away as possible. When I came down the stairs, I froze in the middle of the living room. Where nothing had been before, there was the suitcase, closed, and with its lock intact. My skin crawled. Time seemed to stop as I stared at it. I didn't want to approach it, but something inside me, a mix of curiosity and fear, pushed me toward it. I dropped the backpack and kneeled in front of the suitcase. My trembling hand touched the lock, which looked brand new, as if it had never been rusted. I used a screwdriver to open it. The click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. I opened the suitcase slowly. Inside was something different this time, a small mirror with a worn wooden frame. The mirror reflected something that wasn't my living room. I saw a dark room with cracked walls and dim, flickering light, like it was from a candle. At the back, a tall, hunched figure stood motionless, staring at me. My breath stopped. The figure took a step forward. I slammed the mirror shut and stood up, stepping back. The suitcase remained open, but I didn't dare look inside again. The rest of the night, I sat by the front door, my backpack ready to leave at any moment, but I couldn't bring myself to go. Something in the house kept me there, as if it knew escaping wouldn't change anything. At dawn, I heard a loud bang coming from the attic. The sound was so powerful, it vibrated through the ceiling. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I slowly climbed the attic stairs, flashlight in one hand and hammer in the other. I opened the door carefully, and there it was, in the center of the attic, the one I had found in the suitcase. It was now hanging from one of the beams, reflecting that same dark room, but this time, the figures weren't still. They were slowly moving toward the glass, as if trying to cross through it. I stepped back, but my feet felt heavy. It was as if the air itself was pushing me forward. One of the figures stopped right in front of the mirror. Its face had no defined features, just a dark, flat surface. Slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The mirror vibrated. I felt an icy coldness in my chest, as if something invisible was passing through me. The hammer dropped from my hand, hitting the floor with a hollow sound. The figure in the mirror slowly turned its head, as if it were watching me. And then I heard the words again, this time inside my head. Everything seemed to spiral back to the beginning. I ran from the attic, slamming the door behind me. I raced down the stairs, grabbed my backpack, and bolted out of the house. I jumped into the car and started the engine without a second thought, not daring to look back. As I drove down the empty road, a strange sense of relief washed over me as I put distance between myself and the house. But that relief quickly faded when I reached the end of the road. There it was, my house, right in front of me. The very same house I had just left. With trembling hands I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and stared at the house. The lights were on, and I could see my own figure through one of the windows. I was in the dining room, staring at the cards on the table. The following days passed in a kind of fog. I tried to stay busy, washing dishes, dusting the furniture, even going outside to trim the weeds in the garden, but it all felt superficial. Like none of my actions really mattered. The silence in the house was worse than any noise. Every time I paused for even a moment, I could feel it, an invisible weight, like something was watching me from the walls, from the ceiling. I had locked the cards in the drawer, but I couldn't ignore their presence. It was like they called out to my mind every time I tried to focus on something else. One night, while I sat on the couch with the TV on, I heard a creak coming from the attic. My entire body tensed. I had promised myself I wouldn't go up there again, but I knew I had no choice. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly climbed the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound amplified by the house's silence. The attic door was slightly open. I pushed it gently, shining the flashlight inside. The suitcase was in the center of the room. I remembered it being closed in the dining room. The mirror was still hanging from the beam, but its surface was different. It no longer reflected that dark, twisted world. It reflected the attic, but not as it was now. It reflected the attic as it had been the first day I found it, full of boxes and old furniture. I approached the mirror, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I saw my reflection for a moment, but then it changed. It wasn't me anymore. It was that blurry figure with incomplete features, the one I had seen before. Everything goes back to the beginning, my reflection said suddenly. The mirror began to vibrate. The frame emitted a low sound, like a moan. I took a step back, but the familiar pull in my chest pushed me forward. Don't whisper. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, but they didn't fall to the ground. Instead, the fragments floated in the air, slowly spinning around me. The attic began to crumble. The ceiling seemed to melt, the walls faded away, and the floor beneath my feet felt like sand. I fell to my knees as the glass fragments spun faster, forming a vortex. My mind was flooded with images, the suitcase, the cards, the journal, the figure in the mirror. It all twisted together in a chaotic mess that I couldn't make sense of. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. I woke up in the dining room again. The cards were perfectly arranged in front of me. The suitcase was closed in the corner. I slowly stood up, my body trembling. I looked around the house. It seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. I went to the drawer where I had locked the cards. The lock was intact, but when I opened the drawer, it was empty. The cards that had been on the table weren't the same. I picked up the first one and read it. You can't escape. This is your place. I let it fall and picked up another one. Soon everything will repeat. That night, the whispers started again, but they were louder now. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were clear voices, speaking words I couldn't understand. I locked myself in my room, turning on all the lights, but the sounds kept coming, surrounding me. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my backpack and ran to the front door. Outside, the night was dark, but the cool air offered a brief relief. I jumped into the car and drove aimlessly, trying to get as far away as I could. I drove for hours until the first light of dawn began to brighten the horizon. Finally, I stopped at a small motel by the side of the road. I went inside and rented a room. I just wanted to rest, to escape the torment of the house. But when I opened the door to the room, I froze. The inside wasn't a motel room. It was the dining room of the house, with the suitcase in the corner and the cards on the table. Everything goes back to the beginning. I stood at the corner of that deserted street and stared ahead. The street was quiet. A row of weak streetlights flickered at regular intervals. There were no cars parked on the sidewalk. No one around. Everything felt tight, even though the space was wide. The buildings around me looked old, their walls patched with peeling paint. The pavement was cracked, and the manholes smelled of damp garbage. The air carried a faint odor of stagnant water and decaying leaves. The night sky had no stars. It seemed like the electric wires above were buzzing, but maybe it was just my ears adjusting to the silence. I swallowed, trying to clear my throat, which felt dry. My back was stiff. I wondered if I should continue down this street or find another route, but I didn't know the area well enough. I needed to reach the main avenue. This street would save me a few blocks of walking. I decided to keep going. As I took my first steps, I heard the faint sound of my shoes rubbing against the concrete. My steps echoed softly. The flickering lights maintained a steady pattern, on for a few seconds, then a sudden dimming, and then they returned. Each cycle took 2 or 3 seconds. I tried to count them mentally, but I lost track. I kept moving slowly, my shoulders feeling tense. I noticed a sensation in my stomach, a slight tightness. I tried to ignore it. The closer I got to the first streetlight, the weaker its beam appeared. It cast a thin cone of light that barely reached the center of the street. The edges of that light faded into the darkness. On the left, the building's wall formed a long canvas of opaque concrete. To the right, I saw a metal fence, behind which there could have been a narrow alley or an empty lot, but I couldn't see it clearly. The fence fluttered a little when the wind blew. I could feel the breeze on my face. It was cold and carried a hint of dampness. As I passed under the first street light, I noticed something strange on the wall to my left. A shadow stretched out. At first, I thought it was just my silhouette, but the shape looked odd. The arms seemed longer, and the head appeared to tilt slowly. I stopped and stared. The flickering light played with the contours. I raised my hand, and my own shadow moved, but the shape on the wall didn't match my movement exactly. I hesitated, then it caught up. I took a step forward, and the silhouette on the wall stretched along the cracked surface, seeming to wave an arm, lifting and lowering it in a lazy rhythm. I looked around. There was no one else. No other obvious source of light. I glanced behind me. The next streetlight further ahead flickered with the same pattern. Everything appeared empty and still. But when I looked back at the wall, the silhouette was still there. It moved again, lifting its arms in a slow gesture I couldn't interpret. A shiver ran down my neck. I tried to breathe calmly. I didn't want to panic over a shadow. It was probably just a strange angle of the light. Or maybe something behind me was casting an odd shape. I turned fully to check, but I only saw the fence, the dark lot behind it, and the other side of the street. Nothing moved. When I looked back at the wall, the silhouette was still sliding its form, as if waiting for me to keep walking. I decided to move on. The tension in my shoulders grew as I walked down the street. Each time I passed under another light, new shadows formed on the walls. Some were shorter, others elongated. Some seemed to bend their arms, while others appeared to turn their heads. My legs felt heavier, my heart was pounding faster. The silence around me made the buzzing of the lights louder in my ears. I clenched my jaw and tried to keep my breathing steady. Once, I stopped under a streetlight and stared directly at the wall. The shadows moved in a loop, raising and lowering their arms, twisting slightly as if taking a sideways step. I raised my right arm, keeping it extended. The silhouettes hesitated. After a few flickers of the light, they repeated a similar movement. I took 2 steps back. Finally, they mimicked something like that movement, but always with a delay or some distortion. I spoke out loud, keeping my voice low. "Hello?" My voice sounded rough. I hadn't spoken in a while. No one responded. The shadows kept moving. I tried to listen for any sound besides the electric hum. I didn't hear anything. No distant footsteps, no rustling trash, no murmurs from windows. The buildings didn't have lights on, no televisions, no radios, no music, just me and the changing silhouettes. I felt sweat forming under my jacket. I rubbed my palms together, they were damp. I tried blinking several times, hoping the shapes would disappear, but they didn't. I decided to walk faster. I wanted to reach the end of this street. I estimated I had maybe 2 more streetlights before I reached the main avenue. I could see a brighter glow ahead, probably from the next intersection. If I could get there, I'd be far from those strange lights and shadows. I began to move with longer steps. My footsteps sounded louder now. My breathing became heavier. The silhouette stretched across the walls, following my pace. Every time the lights flickered, the shapes seemed to shake, then continue their slow gestures. As I moved forward, I noticed that when I tried to ignore them, the shadows seemed to draw closer. Or at least, that's how it felt. If I looked ahead and tried not to pay attention, I could see flashes of them moving at the edges of my vision. I could tell they weren't the same. Their arms would rise, then fall. Their heads would tilt. When I looked directly at them, they slowed down, as if trying to appear like normal shadows. I gritted my teeth and kept moving. Halfway through the second stretch of the street, I tried another approach. I stopped and faced the wall. I spoke again. "What do you want?" My voice sounded tense. The silhouettes didn't make a sound. They kept moving. One of them lifted a long-armed shape and seemed to hold it there. I waited. The light flickered, and when it came back, the arm was lower. I stepped closer to the wall. The surface felt rough under my fingers. I could smell dust and a faint, musty smell of old paint lingered in the air. I pressed my hand against the wall. It was cold and solid. Leaning in closer, I tried to spot any detail that might explain the shadows I was seeing. Cracks, pipes, or cables perhaps? I noticed a few cracks in the peeling paint, but nothing that could explain the strange, shifting shapes. I pulled back again. My heart raced in my chest, and I felt a dry, uncomfortable sensation in my mouth. I had no idea what I was dealing with. I decided to leave. There was no reason to stay. I backed away from the wall and quickened my pace, my steps becoming more deliberate. I passed under another flickering streetlight, its dull, erratic light still pulsing in the dark. The silhouettes were always there, following me from one wall to another, never still, constantly shifting. I kept my eyes focused on the distant end of the street, trying to concentrate on the brighter lights that lay ahead. Every step felt like it required more effort. My back felt stiff, and my chest seemed tight. I took a deep breath through my nose, exhaling slowly through my mouth, trying to calm my racing mind. I focused on the little things, the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement, the small pebble I accidentally kicked, the faint rustle of my jacket zipper as I moved my arms. In the distance, I heard a car horn, probably from a larger street. The sound reassured me. It was a reminder that life, normal life, existed beyond this strange street. With every flicker of the streetlights, the silhouettes adjusted their positions. Sometimes they seemed to stretch and elongate, other times, they only moved their arms, bending them at the elbows. Occasionally, they would freeze, standing still as if waiting. I tried to ignore them, focusing instead on moving forward. My legs were beginning to burn from the tension of trying not to run. I kept a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. Finally, I reached the last streetlight before the intersection. I noticed the shadows were fading, becoming weaker. The brighter glow of the main avenue ahead was overpowering the flickering light behind me. The silhouettes looked thinner now, their forms less defined. I could see them struggling to stay visible, their edges trembling as if they were about to vanish. One of them raised its arm again, but it looked faint, fragmented, as if it were dissolving in the patches of light. I paused for a moment and watched. They were still moving, but now with less fluidity. The flickering light continued, but it seemed less intense. I looked back toward the street I had just crossed. It was a straight line of weak lights and crumbling walls. From here, I could see the entire row of flickering streetlights, all of them flashing in sequence. I saw several distorted silhouettes along the walls, each one moving at a different angle. Now they all looked like weak outlines, no noise, no movement toward me. I stepped forward toward the main avenue. The normal city lights were bright and steady now. I could see a traffic light changing color a block away, and I noticed a closed store with a bright security light over its door. Far off, I could hear distant voices, perhaps from people on a nearby avenue. The air felt cleaner here, less humid and stale. As I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished behind. It was like walking away from a conversation just as someone was about to say something important. But I had no idea who they were, or what they were about to say. I kept walking, listening to the sound of my own footsteps on the sidewalk. My legs felt tired now that the tension had eased. I wiped my face with my sleeve, feeling the sweat on my forehead. I tried to think if there was anything else I could have done. Maybe if I had waited longer or asked another question, I could have gotten something more out of it. But I was too restless to stay there. The street had been empty, and those silhouettes made no sense. I didn't want to go back. I wanted normal light, normal sounds, and normal people. I wanted to be away from those flickering patterns and strange shapes. As I kept walking, the memory of that street began to fade. The distant sound of traffic, the stable and constant lights in front of me, helped calm my nerves. I looked at the storefronts, most of which were closed with their metal shutters down. A street sweeper was pushing a cart several blocks away, not looking in my direction. I passed under a bright halogen lamp that lit up the sidewalk clearly. I could see my own shadow, a simple shape that followed closely behind me. It didn't blink, didn't make any gestures, just remained there, a normal shadow. I reached the next intersection, where cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the night. I turned right and continued on my planned route. Behind me, that empty street was probably still flickering, and those silhouettes were probably still moving. But I wouldn't know. I wouldn't look back again. I felt relieved to be away from it, though uneasy about what I had left behind. But there was nothing more to be done about it. I just kept walking, one step at a time, until it became another strange memory from a long, eerie night. The first time I heard about the room was from a guy named Martin. We were sitting at the back of a dimly lit bar, drinking cheap whiskey, when he leaned in and said, "Have you ever heard about the silent room in that old monastery up north?" he asked with a half-smile, as if not fully believing it himself, but wanting to see if I'd take the bait. I shook my head, and then he told me the story. "It's not just quiet," he said. "It's strange. No echo, no sound, nothing. People say it gets into your head." I laughed it off, but that thought stayed with me, haunting me for weeks. Weeks later, I found myself driving north, with nothing better to do. Call it curiosity or boredom, whatever you want, I needed to see it for myself. The monastery was nothing but a shadow of what it once was. Cracked stone walls loomed over a courtyard overtaken by weeds and decay. The front door hung off its hinges, crooked like a dislocated jaw frozen in a silent scream. I parked my car on the gravel driveway and stepped into the courtyard. The air was still, no wind, no birds, nothing. Inside, the place smelled of mold and old wood. My boots echoed loudly as I walked across the tiled floor of what must have been a chapel once. Stained glass windows, most of them shattered, allowed only a few rays of pale, grayish light to filter through. The altar was empty, just a stone slab cracked in the center. I wandered through empty hallways. Everything was covered in dust, enough to write your name in. There were doors that wouldn't open, doors that led to nowhere. And then, at the end of a hallway that felt longer than it should have been, there it was, the door to the silent room. It didn't look special. Just a plain wooden door with rusty hinges. But when I grabbed the handle, it felt colder than the air around it, like it had been sitting in a freezer for years. I pushed the door open, and the hinges screamed loudly, a sound too sharp for the dead silence of the building. Inside, it was pitch dark. No windows, just a small, empty room with walls and a ceiling that felt too close. I lit a match and set fire to the candle I had brought with me. The flickering light revealed the walls, and that's when I saw them. Dark stains covered the plaster, spreading in uneven patches. At first, I thought it was just water damage, but the longer I stared, the clearer they became. Faces. Dozens of them. Some small, no bigger than my hand. Others stretched from floor to ceiling. Their mouths were open, frozen in silent screams. Their eyes were wide, empty. The candlelight made them seem like they were moving, rippling in slow, agonizing waves. I tried to step back, but something stopped me. It felt like my feet were glued to the floor. I opened my mouth to scream, to ask for help, but nothing came out, not a sound. Not even the squeak of my boots against the stone. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't hear it. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to remind myself I was still there. The silence was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing me from the inside. The candle flickered, and I swear the faces on the walls turned to look at me. I leaned against the door, groping for the handle, but it was gone. The door had vanished. Or maybe it never existed. I started banging on the walls, pounding with both fists, but the room didn't give. The faces seemed to draw closer, their expressions twisting into something worse than pain. I tried to scream again, but my throat felt filled with concrete. The candle was burning out, wax dripping over my fingers. The faces kept moving, writhing and twisting as if they were alive, but there was no sound. No whispers, no moans, no screams. Just silence. I don't know how long I was there, minutes, hours. Time didn't seem to work the same way in that room. The air grew thicker with each passing second, as if I were breathing something denser than air. My head throbbed. My chest ached. But I couldn't do anything but stand there, watching the faces change. When the candle finally went out, I was left in total darkness. That's when I felt it. Something brushed against my arm. I jerked away, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. My hands touched the cold plaster, and I could feel the contours of the faces. They weren't just stains. They were raised, as if carved into the wall. The one I touched was smooth, with lips parted like it was about to say something. But the silence devoured everything. I don't remember how I found the door. 1 second, I was pressed against the wall, and the next, I was stumbling into the hallway. The air outside the room was damp and smelled of rot, but at least I could hear my own breathing again. The door slammed behind me, but softly. For a moment, I thought about running, just leaving and never coming back. But curiosity won out. I turned to look at the door one more time. It was just a plain wooden door, nothing special. The creak it made when I opened it was gone, replaced by silence. The hallway was quiet, but not like the room. I could hear my own breathing, the soft rustle of my jacket as I turned to leave. When I got back to my car, the outside world felt off. I couldn't explain it, but everything seemed a little more muted. The colors, the sounds, they were all softer. Even the gravel under my boots didn't crunch like it should. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What was I going to say? That I went into a room and lost my voice, my sense of time, maybe even my sanity? People would think I was crazy. Sometimes, late at night, I think I still feel it, the silence. It's like a weight on my chest, a reminder that the room is still there, waiting. And sometimes, when the lights are off and the house is quiet, I think I see them, faces, watching me from the corners of the room, their mouths open in silent screams. I stood at the entrance, staring into the absolute nothingness that surrounded the house. There was no wind, no sound, no horizon. It was an infinite void, stretching far beyond human comprehension. I stepped back, slowly closing the door. The click of the latch echoed endlessly. My chest felt heavy, as if the air inside the house had grown denser. I returned to the dining room, the cards still neatly arranged. Something was different. Something had changed. The suitcase remained closed in its corner. I approached it cautiously, fearful of what I might find, but unable to ignore it. My hands trembling, I took the top letter and opened it. The house is no longer in your world. Now you are in its world. I dropped the letter as if it were burning my hands, staggering backward, tripping over a chair. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of it, to find a way out, but there was none. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house once more, this time, louder, more defined, coming from the attic. I grabbed the flashlight with one hand, a hammer with the other, and climbed the stairs. Each step creaked underfoot, its sound reverberating like a deep, hollow echo, as if the house itself were amplifying every movement. When I reached the attic, the door was wide open. The flickering lights still cast eerie shadows on the wooden beams. The giant mirror that had once stood in the center of the room was gone, replaced by a circle etched into the floor, surrounded by symbols I couldn't understand. Inside the circle, the suitcase was open, but empty. I moved closer, feeling as though each step drained me of my energy. As I crossed the edge of the circle, the air around me changed. It was no longer heavy or cold, it was non-existent. Inside the circle, all sound ceased. I tried to breathe, but I couldn't feel the air moving through my lungs. Then I saw it. A figure began to materialize inside the circle, emerging slowly from the suitcase as though it were being pulled from another dimension. It was tall, taller than any human, with elongated, twisted limbs. Its face was featureless, but shadows seemed to shift across its surface, forming eyes and mouths that never stayed in one place. I wanted to scream, but I had no voice. The figure raised a hand, pointing at me, and its presence flooded my mind with a torrent of images: the house, the letters, the mirror, my face distorting, the eternal void outside. Everything was connected, all leading back to the same point. The beginning is the end, the figure said, its voice reverberating in my head like a distant thunderclap. When I woke up, I was back in the dining room. The house was completely silent. The letters were gone, and so was the suitcase. I stood up slowly, feeling my body heavier than usual, and walked to the front door. I opened it, and outside, the world had returned. There were trees, a gravel road, and the clear sky bathed in the morning sun. For a moment, I thought it was all over. But when I looked down, I saw something in my hand, a small letter. I opened it, knowing what I would find. Everything returns to the beginning. That was the last time I tried to escape. Now I know that I can't run. The house isn't just a place, it's an endless cycle, a prison that will always pull me back to its core. The days go on, but every action, every thought is tainted by the certainty that I will return, to the attic, to the mirror, to the void. I no longer search for answers. I simply wait, knowing that eventually, everything will start again. I shouldn't have gone down there. The building supervisor made it clear the first week I moved in. The basement is off limits. It's forbidden, he said, his tone low and firm, as if warning me of something far worse than simple safety hazards. But I couldn't resist. There was something in his tone, the way he avoided looking me directly in the eye when he said it, It made it impossible not to wonder what he was hiding. The building was old, a crumbling stack of bricks and mortar, like it had something to prove. It was broken and desperate, and when I found a place I could afford, I didn't ask too many questions. But the basement wouldn't leave me alone. One night, after a few beers and too much time staring at the ceiling, I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the creaky stairs. The basement door wasn't even locked. That should have been my first warning. If they were serious about keeping people out, why not lock it? The latch opened easily, and the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. It was darker than I expected. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the gloom, swaying as I tried to steady my hand. The steps creaked loudly underfoot, sharp and piercing in the silence. There was no hum of appliances, no distant drip of water, just silence, as if the entire space had been drained of sound. When I reached the bottom, the smell hit me. It wasn't rotten or damp, it was nothing, as if the air itself had been stripped of any trace of existence. The room stretched further than I expected. My flashlight flickered over old wooden beams, forgotten piles of junk, and then, the paintings. At first, I didn't even notice them. They were tucked into a small nook along the back wall, arranged carefully as if someone had taken the time to place them there. The frames were ornate, gold and black, coated in dust. The paintings themselves were dark, muted colors, shadows devouring most of the details. But the faces. I moved closer. The beam of my flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. There were about 10 in total, portraits, all staring directly ahead. Men, women, young, old, each one had the classic look of oil paintings, high collars, stiff poses, solemn expressions. Except something was wrong. At first, I didn't notice, but the longer I looked, the more it became clear. Their mouths were too small, their eyes too large. The proportions didn't add up, as if the artist had guessed what people look like without ever having seen one. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just the cold. I stepped closer, leaning in. Their expressions were neutral, but there was something in the way their faces tilted that made me feel evaluated. The flashlight flickered again. I cursed under my breath, smacking it against my hand. The beam steadied and for a second, I thought I saw the man's eyes blink. I froze in place. It was subtle, barely perceptible, a tiny tremor in his eyelids, like a slow, lazy blink. I stepped back, my feet shifting as I moved toward another painting, a woman this time, her hair tied back, wearing a dress adorned with lace and ruffles. She had the same dead expression, but now, her lips were slightly parted. I could almost swear they had been closed before. My chest tightened. The lantern flickered again, and I hit it harder this time, my breathing quickening. When the light returned, her mouth stretched into a smile. But it wasn't just any smile, it was too wide. The corners of her lips were curved unnaturally, almost as if they had been forced into that shape. The man, with his slick back hair, was smiling now too, his lips tight against his teeth. Another man, older, with a white beard, had his eyes narrowed and his head tilted, as if he were listening to something. A young woman with a pale, soft face had her mouth wide open, her dark, heavy tongue resting in the middle. My pulse pounded in my ears. I stumbled backward, trying to keep the lantern steady, trying not to blink. The floorboards creaked under my feet, louder now, as if protesting against my weight. It was fine, I whispered to myself, a sharp prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as though tiny needles were scraping against my skin. I stopped. The air behind me felt heavy, pressing against me just enough for me to notice. The upper parts of the frames jutted out from the wall, the faces angled slightly downward. They were all watching me. I could feel their eyes on me. I tripped backward, nearly falling over my own feet. The lantern flickered again, and this time, when it steadied, the faces were closer. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps, no scraping of the frames against the wall. but they were closer now, their features sharper, more detailed. The woman with her hair pulled up tilted her head to one side, her grotesquely wide smile still intact. The man with the beard was showing his teeth, his gums dark and swollen. I ran up the stairs, but they seemed farther than they should have been, as if the room had stretched somehow. My boots thudded on the floorboards, each step echoing like a gunshot. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I reached the stairs, I nearly fell, grabbing the handrail just in time to stop myself from tumbling. But I didn't stop running. I practically threw myself up to the top. The door was still open, letting in a strip of light. I reached it, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. My chest rose and fell as I tried to catch my breath, my throat tight. The cold from the basement clung to me. I didn't go back down. I didn't even tell anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still, and I'm lying in bed, I feel that sharp sensation in my neck again. It all started like any other evening. Work had been endless, and I was determined to get home as quickly as possible. I remember glancing at the clock on my car's dashboard, 6:47 p.m. The sun had already begun to set, casting a faint orange glow across the sky. My usual route home would take about 25 more minutes. But then I saw the dirt road to my right, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I had passed it dozens of times but never taken it. It was one of those things people talked about, but rarely used, like a shortcut that supposedly saved 10, maybe 15 minutes. That was enough for me. I turned on the blinker, veered onto the path, and immediately felt the crunch of gravel under my tires. The road was narrow, with trees lining both sides, their branches intertwining to almost form a tunnel. I remember thinking about how quiet it had gotten as soon as I left the main road. No engines, no horns, just the soft hum of my car and the occasional snap of a branch under the tires. At first, it felt fine, even peaceful. The air smelled damp, like the forest had absorbed the heat of the day and was now releasing it. But then, I noticed something strange, something that didn't feel quite right. The trees seemed closer, not in a supernatural way, but in a way that made the path feel tighter, more confined. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. A few minutes later, the tension began. It wasn't much at first, just a flash of movement to my left, out of the corner of my eye. I thought I saw something, a shadow slipping between the trees. I turned my head to look, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint outlines of trunks and branches. I shrugged it off, letting out a nervous laugh. "Relax," I whispered. "Probably a deer or something." The road started to get rougher. Potholes appeared more frequently, and my car jolted every time I drove over one. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter. The headlights barely seemed to cut through the growing darkness. I could feel my pulse at my temples now, steady but noticeable. I reached for the radio, hoping the noise would break the silence, but all I got was static. "Never mind," I thought. "I'll be out of here soon." Then I heard it, a knock behind me. My stomach twisted. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze my hands on the wheel. I looked in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was darkness. "Probably a branch," I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded unsure, even to me. I kept driving, trying to convince myself it didn't matter, but the feeling wouldn't go away. 2 minutes later, it happened again, a louder thud this time, like something had hit the trunk of my car. My hands were sweaty on the wheel now. I looked in the mirror again, but it was useless. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but behind me was nothing but black. "It's fine," I said aloud, trying to sound firm. "Keep going." I pressed the gas a little harder, the car bouncing and jolting beneath me. The car shook as the road deteriorated, and the trees seemed even thicker now, their branches stretching out as if trying to block my path. My breathing became heavier with each passing moment. and every time I thought I saw something move outside, my heart would skip a beat. Just when I thought I could push through, bang! Something slammed into the passenger door with such force that I jumped so violently my foot slipped off the accelerator. For a second, the car slowed down, but I quickly pressed the pedal again, my heart racing. What the hell was that? I screamed, not expecting an answer. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it pounding in my ears. I didn't dare stop. I didn't even look at the door. My eyes stayed locked on the road, my knuckles turning white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. The logical part of my brain was screaming, it was a rock. A branch. Anything. Don't think about it, just drive. But the noises wouldn't stop. Another bang, this time on the roof, followed by a scratching sound that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like long nails dragging across metal. My hands were shaking now. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind, or a fallen branch, anything, just so I wouldn't completely lose my grip on reality. And then I saw it. Up ahead, in the middle of the road, there was a figure. It stood there, barely illuminated by the headlights. It didn't move, didn't signal for help, just stood motionless. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. My chest rose and fell rapidly as I stared at the figure. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any details. The shadows of the trees were playing tricks on my eyes, making it appear blurry, as if it was flickering in and out of focus. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" But there was no reply. The figure remained still. My throat was dry, and my palms were so sweaty I could barely hold the wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but the road was too narrow. I'd have to reverse, and the thought of not knowing what was behind me made my stomach churn. "Move!" I shouted again, hitting the horn. The sound echoed through the trees, but the figure didn't flinch. It was as if it didn't even hear me, like it wasn't really there at all. That's when I noticed the shadows again, not just the one in front of me, but others moving between the trees, dark flashes just beyond the reach of my lights. My chest tightened. I was surrounded. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. My breath was short and fast, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely grip the wheel. To hell with it. I stomped on the gas, and the car shot forward. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the figure move, just a slight turn of the head, as if it was watching me pass. My stomach churned, but I didn't stop. The car bounced and jerked as I sped down the road, the branches scraping against the windows like claws. The sounds continued, soft, deliberate knocks on the roof, the doors, even the trunk, like something or someone was climbing the car. I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. I just had to get out of there. Finally I saw it. The end of the forest. The trees thinned out, and I could make out the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. A wave of relief flooded over me. I slammed the gas pedal harder, the engine roaring as I sped toward the light. As soon as I hit the main road, the sound stopped abruptly. No more banging, no more scratching, no movement. I drove a few more minutes before pulling over to the shoulder. My hands were still shaking as I turned off the engine. My chest heaved as I tried to calm myself. After a while, I gathered the courage to get out of the car. My legs were like jelly as I walked around, checking the doors, the roof, the trunk. Nothing. No scratches, no dents, no signs of anything hitting the car. But when I opened the passenger door, my blood ran cold. There, on the seat, was a dark, smudged handprint, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass from the inside. I slammed the doors shut and jumped back into the driver's seat. Without a second glance, I sped off toward home, never once looking back. I never took that shortcut again. I never will. It started with a job offer, caretaker for an isolated property. The pay was good, and the place was hours away from anything resembling civilization. I thought it couldn't be worse than sleeping on a friend's couch. The mansion wasn't exactly welcoming when I arrived late in the afternoon. It loomed at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by twisted trees and a silence so thick it hurt my ears. The house was made of dark wood, with narrow windows as if it had been built to keep the outside world away. There was a key waiting for me in a rusty lockbox next to the door, along with a sheet of instructions: keep the generator running. Don't touch the old objects. Avoid the north wing after sunset. I chuckled as I read it. Avoid a hallway? I was there to fix leaky pipes, not to buy into ghost stories. Inside, the mansion was no better. It was covered in dust, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the air was thick and damp, like the walls had absorbed years of sorrow and misery. After dropping my bag in the first room that had a decent bed, I went to explore. I found the north wing quickly. The hallway was narrower than the others, and even in the fading light of the afternoon, it seemed darker. The walls were covered in faded portraits. The faces were so blurry and distorted that I couldn't make out any features. At the end of the hall was a door, old, dark wood, covered in barely visible carvings, worn away by time. Maybe they were symbols. The whole place gave me an unsettling feeling, but I wasn't about to get spooked by a hallway. I had more important things to do, like figuring out how to start the generator before it got dark. When I finally got the generator running, it was already night. The mansion was in complete silence except for the hum of the machinery outside. The occasional moan of the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls was exhausting, but a persistent curiosity kept me awake. I grabbed my flashlight and went back to the north wing. The hallway was colder now, and my skin prickled as I stepped into the shadows. The air smelled faintly of metal, like old coins. I walked slowly, directing the light over the portraits hanging on the walls. The light barely seemed to penetrate the darkness. When I reached the door, I stopped. The engravings appeared sharper now, but they were still indecipherable. Then I heard it. A scratch. At first, it was weak, like a mouse dragging its claws across the wood. Then it grew louder, more deliberate, coming from the other side of the door. My mouth went dry, and the flashlight trembled in my hand. I leaned forward, my ear just inches from the surface. The scratching stopped. I should have stepped back, I knew that even then, but I grabbed the doorknob and turned it. It was icy. The door didn't budge. I pushed harder, and it gave way with a low creak. There was nothing, no room, no floor, just darkness. It wasn't simply dark. It was like staring into a hole that shouldn't exist. The beam of my flashlight stopped abruptly, swallowed by the void. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the space. Then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, pale and stretched like wet paper, with huge eyes that didn't blink. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out, just a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The scratching started again, louder now, long, uneven fingers pressed against the edge of the void, scraping against nothing. They didn't break through, but they didn't stop either. I slammed the door shut and ran. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop until I reached my room, where I locked the door. My pulse echoed in my ears. I sat there, holding the flashlight, listening to see if anything had followed me. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces. I convinced myself it must have been some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the light, or my brain playing tricks on me. I went back to the hallway. The door was shut. No scratches. No strange sounds. I stood there for a while, just staring, but I didn't touch it again. The day passed slowly. I kept myself busy, fixing a leaky sink and checking the old plumbing, anything to keep my mind off the hallway. But when night fell, the scratching started again. Weak at first, then stronger. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but I couldn't resist. This time, I didn't open the door. I just stood in the hallway, listening. The scratching stopped, replaced by a whisper. It wasn't exactly words, just a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. My chest felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing me down. I stumbled back to my room, but the whisper followed me. It was faint, barely audible, like it was coming from inside my own head. By the third night, I was a wreck. The whisper had turned into a constant hum, and the scratching echoed throughout the house. I tried calling the number from the job listing, but the line was dead. I decided I was done. I packed up, sealed everything, and returned to the north wing. The hallway was darker than ever. The air was icy. The door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I approached, my stomach tightening with each step. The void was still there, and the faces were closer. I could see their eyes moving, following me. The whisper was louder now, almost like a chant. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the flashlight. It rolled to the edge of the void and stopped. I should have left it there, but I didn't. I bent down, and as soon as my fingers touched the flashlight, something moved. One of the faces lunged forward, its mouth stretching beyond what should have been possible. A skeletal, clawed hand shot out, trying to reach me. I fell back, stumbling as I stood up and slammed the door shut. The whisper stopped. The scratching stopped. But the door didn't lock. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my room, holding the broken leg of a chair as though it could do anything against whatever was behind that door. In the morning, the front door opened without issue. I didn't look back. That was 6 months ago. I don't know what was behind that door, and I don't want to know. Sometimes, I still hear the faint whisper, like my ears are tricking me. But I never get near a closed door after dark. Never again. I remember it all started with a strange job, a night watchman for a secluded warehouse. 12-hour shifts. Weekly cash payment. The ad was too tempting for someone in my situation. I showed up the same day for the interview. The building was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty fields. The brick walls were faded, and the tall windows had rusted bars. There was a single metal door with a sign that said, "Authorized personnel only." The man who interviewed me seemed rushed, like he had no time for questions. He handed me a list of instructions: keep the main door locked. Do rounds every 2 hours. Don't use the radio after midnight. If you hear something strange, don't investigate. Something strange, like what? I asked, trying to keep the tone light. Doesn't matter. Just follow the instructions. I didn't like his answer, but I needed the money. I started that very night. I arrived just before 8 p.m. The office was small, with an uncomfortable chair, a metal desk, and an old monitor showing black and white footage from the security cameras. There were 7 cameras in total, each focused on a different section of the warehouse. At 9 p.m., I did my first round. The warehouse was bigger on the inside than it appeared from the outside. The hallways were filled with tall shelves stacked with vaguely labeled boxes. There was an abandoned feel to it, the air thick with the smell of damp cardboard. Everything was quiet until 11:30 p.m., when I returned to the office. As I was reviewing the cameras, I noticed something strange on camera 3, which pointed to a hallway at the back of the warehouse. I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a rat or something similar, but the movement was too big. I leaned in closer to the monitor, adjusting the brightness. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The hallway was empty. I shook my head and went back to my routine. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. At midnight, I remembered the rule about not using the radio after that hour. Out of curiosity, I turned it on for a few seconds. All I heard was static mixed with something that sounded like a low whisper. I quickly turned the radio off, feeling a little foolish for breaking the rule. At 2 a.m., during my third round, I heard a noise. It was a dull thud followed by a dragging sound. My heart started to race. I remembered the rule: if you hear something strange, don't investigate. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling or maybe the wind hitting a window. But the sound kept going, this time closer. I decided to take a look, even though my instinct told me not to. I walked toward the area where the noise seemed to be coming from, the light of my flashlight illuminating the shelves. The boxes were there, but I didn't see anything out of place. Then I heard slow, heavy footsteps. I quickly turned the flashlight towards the end of the hallway, but there was nothing. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving me in an oppressive silence. It took a moment for me to realize that I was holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale. In a panic, I rushed back to the office, slamming the door shut behind me. I glanced at the cameras once more. On the CCTV monitor, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, motionless. It looked human, but its posture was strange, as if it were leaning forward unnaturally. The figure was holding something in its hands, but the image was too blurry to make out what it was. I blinked and looked again, but the figure was gone. A cold sweat crawled down my spine. I frantically checked every camera, but there was nothing else. I decided to stay in the office until dawn. There was no way I was taking any more chances. I turned off the office lights, locked the door, and sat in the chair, holding the flashlight in one hand and an old bat I found in the corner of the room in the other. Hours passed in silence, with my breath being the only sound in the room. I kept checking the clock, counting the minutes. At 4:15 a.m., I heard a knock on the office door. It was slow, rhythmic, 3 knocks followed by a pause. I froze, staring at the door. Whoever was out there didn't seem to want to get in. They were just knocking. "Who's there?" I said, my voice barely audible. The knocking stopped. I waited, but nothing happened. I didn't open the door, and I didn't move a muscle. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously left the office. Everything was just as I had left it. The hallways were empty, the boxes were intact. There was no sign of the figure I had seen on the camera, nor any trace of the knocks on the door. That morning, when the supervisor arrived, I told him what had happened. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was imagining things, but he didn't. He just looked at me with a serious expression and said, "That's why we don't want anyone using the radio after midnight." I never returned to work there. But I still wonder what was in that warehouse, or what I heard in that static. There are nights when I dream of those knocks on the door, 3 knocks, a pause. They always come back to my mind, as if they were calling from somewhere I'll never understand. The paved road was a relief after the dirt path. I accelerated a little, even though my hands were still tense on the steering wheel. I could feel the cold of the night air seeping through the slightly open window, but I didn't mind. I needed to stay alert as I neared the small town. The lights of a few buildings started to appear in the distance. The first well-lit structure I came across was a gas station. The sign flickered, but the place seemed open. I parked near the entrance, where the lights were brightest. As I stepped out of the car, I felt the damp chill of the night air on my face. My feet were a bit wet, and the movements felt heavier, like the tension of the last few minutes was still lingering. I entered the gas station store. The place was empty except for an employee behind the counter, a middle-aged man. There was a faint smell of gasoline mixed with the scent of old coffee. I bought a bottle of water and approached the counter. "Is there a motel nearby?" I asked. The employee nodded slowly, pointing towards the road. "About 2 kilometers ahead, on the right. It's nothing special, but it's open." I thanked him, paid, and quickly left. As I walked back to my car, I scanned the shadows, still feeling that nagging unease at the base of my neck, as if someone were watching me. I got into the car and locked the doors before starting the engine. I followed the employee's directions, and as he had said, I found the motel just a couple of minutes later. It was a small, simple building with a neon sign that read "Vacancies" in faded red letters. The parking lot was nearly empty, and only a couple of windows had lights on. I parked near the office and entered. The inside was dimly lit by a desk lamp and a coffee machine in the corner. A woman with glasses and a bored expression was behind the counter. "Need a room?" she asked without making eye contact. I nodded, paid in cash, and she slid a key across the counter with a form that I quickly filled out. "Third door on the right," she indicated with little interest. I took the key in my backpack and quickly made my way to the assigned room, feeling every sound around me amplified: the creak of my steps, the soft drip of water from a nearby drain, the faint hum of a streetlight. I opened the door, locked it behind me, and immediately bolted it. The room was basic, with a double bed, a nightstand, and a dim lamp. The air smelled slightly musty, but I didn't care. I was safe. I dropped my backpack on the floor, took off my jacket, and sat on the edge of the bed. I drank some water and tried to relax, but my mind kept replaying the events of the night, the figures around my car and how they vanished into the shadows. The memory was still fresh. I couldn't stop thinking about how eerily silent they had been, like none of them spoke or reacted with violence. I lay back on the bed, my arms behind my head. My breathing started to calm, but the exhaustion still kept me from falling asleep. I closed my eyes, but in the darkness of my thoughts, I could still see them, the slow, calculated movements, the indecipherable whispers. And that moment when the tallest figure looked directly at me, as if measuring my intentions, I knew that I probably wouldn't understand what had just happened. But at least I was far from that place. The distant sound of traffic on the road served as a reminder that I was back in civilization, away from the isolation and danger of that camp. Slowly, I let the exhaustion pull me into sleep, thankful that for now, everything was over. I had always thought my shift at the hospital would be like any other. It was a quiet night, and the reduced staff made the hallways feel empty, almost cavernous. There was something about the fluorescent lighting that made everything seem colder than it really was. My job was simple: check the rooms, make sure the patients were comfortable, and help the medical staff if needed. But that night, my rounds took me to the hospital's oldest wing, a section that wasn't used anymore except for storage. Some employees avoided that part of the building. There were rumors, of course, stories of shadows moving through the halls, lights flickering for no reason, and doors closing on their own. I never paid much attention to those stories. I thought they were just inventions to scare the new employees. Around midnight, I was asked to take some supplies to the storage room in that wing. I grabbed a cart with boxes and pushed open the double doors leading into that section. The air changed instantly. It was colder, denser. The usual hospital sounds, the hum of machines, the murmur of conversations, faded behind me. The hallway was in complete silence. The lights flickered occasionally, casting shadows that seemed to move. The floor tiles reflected my figure, distorting it. I dropped off the boxes in the storage room quickly, eager to return to the well-lit, crowded areas. I closed the metal storage door, making sure it was properly locked. When I turned to head back, I heard a sound behind me. It was a soft thud, like something had fallen on the storage room floor I had just left. My first thought was that maybe one of the boxes hadn't been placed properly. I sighed and opened the door again. The room was exactly as I had left it. The boxes were stacked correctly, and nothing was on the floor. I quickly exited, feeling somewhat ridiculous for getting scared over so little. On the way back, I noticed something strange. The lights seemed to flicker more frequently. Every time one light went out, the hallway seemed darker than it should be. Halfway down the corridor, I heard footsteps. They weren't my own. They were slower, heavier, as if someone was walking behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned my head. There was no one there. The hallway was empty except for the shadows cast by the flickering lights. I quickened my pace, feeling my heart start to race. The footsteps behind me sped up too. I turned left into the next hallway, almost running now. I knew I was being irrational, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was following me. I finally reached the double doors that separated the old wing from the rest of the hospital. I pushed the doors, expecting the relief of returning to a well-lit, noisy area, but the doors wouldn't open. I pushed again, this time harder, but they didn't budge. Panic started to rise in my throat. I turned to look at the hallway behind me. There, at the far end, stood a figure. It was tall, thin, barely visible in the flickering light. It stood still, its head slightly tilted to one side, as if it were watching me. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding weaker than I expected. The figure didn't respond. I took a step back, pressing myself against the doors. My hand fumbled for the keyring in my pocket, trembling as I tried to find the key that would unlock the doors. The figure began to move. It didn't walk normally, its steps were uneven, as if dragging one leg. My fingers finally found the key. I shoved it into the lock and turned it desperately. The doors opened with a click. As I quickly threw myself to the other side, slamming the door shut behind me, I stood there, gasping for air, my chest tight with panic. The hallway of the active wing of the hospital seemed to close in around me, its familiar lights and sounds making everything feel eerily normal, like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But I knew better. I glanced through the small window in the door. The figure was gone. I was left in silence, trying to steady my breath, feeling the weight of what I had just witnessed. When I returned to the nursing station, I tried to act like nothing had happened, not wanting to alarm anyone. I sat quietly, the events of the night still heavy in my mind. The next day, I finally told one of my colleagues about the experience, hoping they would laugh it off or tell me I was just imagining things. But their reaction was far from what I expected. Their expression darkened, and they whispered, "You're not the first one to see something there, and you won't be the last." That was the last night I worked the night shift. I never returned to that old wing of the hospital. But even now, I still dream of that figure, standing still at the end of the hallway, its head tilted as if waiting for something. I don't know what it was, but I know it was there. I had always thought my shift at the hospital would be like any other. It started out like a quiet, uneventful night. The reduced staff made the hallways feel almost empty, like they stretched endlessly in all directions. There was something about the dim lighting that made everything feel colder, more oppressive than it really was. My job was simple enough: check on the rooms, make sure the patients were comfortable, and assist the medical staff if they needed anything. But that night, something led me to the oldest part of the hospital. It was a section that was no longer used except for storage, a place that most employees avoided. There were rumors, of course, stories of shadows moving through the hallways, lights flickering for no reason, and doors closing on their own. I never paid much attention to those stories, thinking they were just made-up tales to scare the new hires. Around midnight, I was asked to take some supplies to the storage room in that section. I grabbed a cart full of boxes and pushed open the double doors leading into the old wing. The moment I stepped through, the air changed. It was colder, thicker. The usual hum of the hospital, the faint murmur of voices, seemed to vanish the moment I entered. The hallway was eerily silent, save for the occasional flickering light casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The floor tiles reflected my distorted figure as I walked, like something out of a nightmare. I secured the metal door of the storage room, making sure it was locked tightly, but when I turned to leave, I heard a sound behind me. It was a soft thud, as if something had fallen on the floor of the storage room. My first thought was that maybe one of the boxes wasn't stacked properly. I sighed and opened the door again. The room was exactly as I had left it, boxes stacked neatly, nothing out of place. I quickly left, feeling a bit ridiculous for letting myself get scared over something so small. As I made my way back, I noticed something strange. The lights seemed to flicker more often now, and each time one went out, the hallway grew darker. like it was swallowing the light. Midway down the hall, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy ones, following me. I froze, turning my head quickly, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just shadows dancing in the dim light. I quickened my pace, my heartbeat racing as I heard the footsteps behind me match my rhythm. I turned down the next hallway, almost running now. Rationality was slipping away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. I finally reached the double doors separating the old wing from the rest of the hospital and pushed them with all my strength, hoping to escape into the bright, bustling corridors on the other side. But the doors wouldn't open. I tried again, this time with more force, but they wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my throat. I spun around to look down the hallway behind me. At the far end, standing motionless under the flickering light, was a figure. Tall, thin, and barely visible, it stood there, its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it were watching me. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling more than I expected. The figure didn't respond. I took a step back, pressing myself against the doors, my hand frantically searching for the key in my pocket. My fingers were shaking so much that it took several moments to find the key. I slid it into the lock, turning it desperately. The doors clicked open, and I threw myself through, slamming them shut behind me. I stood there, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest, as the lights of the active wing of the hospital surrounded me. It was familiar, safe, but I knew deep down that what I had just experienced was far from over. The sound, eerie and familiar, echoed through the air. I peered through the small window of the door, but the figure was gone. With a sense of dread lingering in the pit of my stomach, I turned back toward the nursing station, trying to act as though nothing had happened. I didn't say a word to my coworkers. I sat there in silence, the weight of what I had just witnessed pressing heavily on my chest. The next day, I decided to confide in one of my colleagues. I expected laughter, a teasing remark, or a suggestion that I was imagining things. Instead, his face grew dark, and his voice dropped to a low whisper. "You're not the first to see something there," he said quietly. "And you won't be the last." That was the last night I worked the night shift. I never returned to that old wing of the building, but I still dream of that figure, frozen at the end of the hall, head tilted as if it were waiting for something. I don't know what it was, but I know it was there. As I drove along the road, the world around me seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The open fields gave way to scattered forests, and from time to time, a car passed by in the opposite direction. The constant hum of the engine and the shifting landscape brought me a sense of temporary peace. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the rearview mirror more often than usual, looking for something I couldn't quite name, unsure of what I expected to find. The shadows from the previous night lingered in my mind. After driving for a couple of hours, I decided I needed a break. I found a small park by the roadside, complete with a picnic area and restrooms. I parked in the empty lot and sat for a moment, watching the tall trees surrounding the area. The place was deserted, seemingly safe, but the silence hung in the air, almost suffocating. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath of the fresh air. Under a large tree was a picnic table, and I sat down with my water bottle, allowing my mind to wander as I tried to process everything that had happened. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to reflect. What had those people wanted? Their movements, their whispers, and their hidden glances all seemed deliberate, but also incomprehensible. They didn't seem like mere car thieves. There was something in their behavior, in their collective silence, that continued to unsettle me deeply. As I gazed toward the forest, I heard a distant rustling, like something, or someone, moving between the trees. My grip on the bottle tightened instinctively. I listened again, straining to identify the source of the sound. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my thoughts drifted back to the night before, to those almost inaudible whispers and movements. I slowly stood up, my heart beginning to race. I scanned the surroundings, making sure no one was nearby. The sound stopped, leaving only the faint whisper of the wind through the leaves, breaking the silence. I decided it was time to leave. I hurried back to the car, checking the area once more before getting in. I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I took one last look toward the forest. Nothing moved among the trees, but the air felt heavier, as though something invisible was following me. I drove back onto the road, leaving the park behind. The rest of the journey was uneventful, but my mind kept searching for connections. There was something more to what I had experienced, a pattern I couldn't quite see. When I finally reached a larger city, I felt a bit more relaxed. There was traffic, tall buildings, and people walking on the sidewalks. The bustle of everyday life was a reminder that the world was still normal, even though my mind was still trapped in the shadows of the previous night. I found a decent motel on the outskirts of town and decided to stay there for the night. I wasn't up for any more driving. After checking in, I carried my things to the room, took a shower, and laid down on the bed. I turned on the TV, hoping to find something to distract me. The images and sounds helped calm me a little, but my mind kept returning to the same place. Even in the safety of this room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me from afar. I always thought abandoned house stories were just that, stories, until I was offered a ridiculous amount of money to spend a night in one. The challenge was simple: stay until dawn in an old mansion on the edge of the forest. No tricks, no hired actors to scare me, just me and the house. The mansion, locally known as the House of Whispers, had been abandoned for decades. People said anyone who spent a night there came out changed, if they came out at all. Desperate for money and too overconfident to admit it, I agreed without much thought. I arrived at the house at dusk. It was massive, with tall windows reflecting the last rays of the sun. The bricks were blackened by time, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as if a strong gust could knock it down. I carried a backpack with the essentials: a flashlight, a water bottle, a small knife, just in case, and a book to pass the time. I didn't expect much more than the creaking of old wood and drafts of wind. I pushed open the door and entered. The inside was worse than I had imagined. The air was thick with humidity, mixed with a pungent smell I couldn't identify. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the walls were covered in torn wallpaper, with dark stains spreading in strange patterns. My plan was simple: stay on the ground floor, avoid exploring too much, and leave by dawn. For a while, everything was quiet. The sound of my breathing seemed to fill the house. I turned on the flashlight and began to inspect the place. There was an old living room with furniture covered in dust, a kitchen with rusted utensils still on the shelves, and a long hallway that led to a spiral staircase. I told myself I wasn't going up those stairs, no way. I settled in the living room, using my backpack as support for my back, and opened my book. The silence was thick, but I focused on the words in front of me. Then I heard it, a low murmur, almost imperceptible, as if it was coming from another room. "The wind," I said aloud, trying to calm myself. But the murmur continued sporadic, barely a hum on the edge of my hearing. Ignore it, I thought. But the more I tried to concentrate on my book, the clearer it became. It wasn't full sentences, more like a dragging of syllables, as if someone was trying to speak but couldn't form complete words. I got up slowly, flashlight in hand, following the sound down the hallway toward the kitchen. The murmur seemed to come from the stairs. I stopped at the foot of the spiral staircase. The light from my flashlight barely reached the end of the stairs, and the shadows danced on the curved walls. The sound kept growing louder. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling slightly. The murmur stopped, and the silence that followed was so deep I could feel a buzzing in my ears. Then, a loud bang from above. I took a step back. There must be an animal or something. I gripped the flashlight tighter and returned to the living room. I sat down, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. The bang came again, this time directly above me, right on the ceiling. I looked up, and the peeling paint on the ceiling seemed to move with every sound. Then, another murmur, clearer this time. I froze. My throat went dry. "Who's there?" I shouted. Silence. I grabbed my backpack, determined to leave. I didn't care about the money. As I made my way to the door, something stopped me. It was locked. I twisted the doorknob over and over, but it wouldn't budge. I checked the windows. They were shut tight. I even tried breaking one with an old chair, but the glass didn't give. It was as if the house itself was sealed shut. The murmur came back, louder now, like a low, guttural chorus filling the air. My flashlight flickered and went out. I didn't scream. I hit the flashlight against my hand, trying to get it to work. The light came back on, but it was weak. A footstep echoed in the hallway, then another. I turned the flashlight towards the living room entrance, but there was nothing. The murmur turned into a clear, repetitive whisper. "We don't want you here." I felt paralyzed. My heart was racing so fast I could barely think. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere, as if the walls were repeating it. The flashlight went out again. In the pitch black, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I jerked away and fell to the floor. Crawling, I knew I didn't want to stay. The whisper followed me, repeating with each step. "Leave! Leave!" I reached the kitchen and found a window that seemed older than the others. I hit the frame until it gave way, breaking the glass with my elbow. I cut myself, but I didn't care. I crawled through the opening and fell to the ground outside. I ran towards my car without looking back. When I started the engine and pulled away, I saw the house in the rearview mirror. In one of the second-story windows, a dark figure was standing, staring at me. I never went back for my backpack or the money. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear that whisper in my head. "We don't want you here." I remember that night began calmly. I had left a friend's house later than usual, and was on my way home after a long day. It was almost midnight. The two-lane road stretched ahead of me, cloaked in complete darkness. There were no streetlights, no moon in the sky. I'd been driving for at least an hour without seeing another car. I felt calm, despite my rush to get home. The radio was off, and the car's interior was silent except for the faint hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the asphalt. A few minutes later, I glanced at the rearview mirror, thinking I'd seen something in my peripheral vision. At first, I didn't see anything, just the darkness behind me. Then I saw two small lights in the distance, headlights. Another car. I was surprised. I didn't expect company on this desolate stretch of road. I watched the lights for a second before focusing back on the road. The lines on the asphalt were faint, and I was trying to keep the car straight. The headlights of the other vehicle were far away, but they stayed visible. After a while, I looked again. This time, the lights were much closer, steadily closing the distance. The road started to curve slightly, so I slowed down. The other car closed the gap too quickly. I checked my speedometer. I was slightly under the speed limit. I pressed the accelerator to speed up, but the lights behind me matched my speed, keeping the same distance. At first, I thought maybe it was just another driver heading home, but something strange occurred to me. The other car seemed to mimic my movements. When I swerved right to avoid a pothole, its headlights moved in the same direction. When I returned to the center of the road, they did the same. I switched to the right lane, and the headlights followed. I frowned. I knew there were no intersections or exits nearby. The next landmark was a gas station, but it was several miles away. Everything else was just empty fields and patches of trees on either side of the road. I slowed down to let the other car pass. I gently tapped the brake, and my speed dropped. The lights behind me dimmed, and the other vehicle slowed down too, staying right behind me. It didn't pass or pull back. I pressed the accelerator again to regain my speed, but the other car did the same. My breathing quickened, my hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. I tried to relax, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, those headlights were still there, bright and persistent. I decided to try something else. I signaled right, slowed down, and waited for the car to pass. But it didn't. It stayed right behind me, so close I could feel the pressure on my chest. My mind started racing. What did they want? Why didn't they pass me? I tried accelerating again, slamming my foot on the pedal. The car roared as my speedometer shot up, but the headlights didn't fade. The other car closed the distance even more, just a few feet from my rear bumper. I tapped the brake harder, but the other car responded instantly. It didn't hit me, but the timing was terrifying. It was like they knew exactly what I was going to do. I thought about stopping, but there was no proper shoulder, just a narrow strip of gravel along the edge of the road, and honestly, I didn't know if it would be safe to stop. My hands clenched the wheel, my shoulders tensed. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept worrying about the car behind me. Then I felt it, a slight bump on my rear bumper. I gasped and gripped the wheel tighter. My car swerved for a moment before I steadied it. The impact wasn't strong enough to knock me off the road, but it was clear, it was a warning. Sweat was pouring down my forehead. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The lights were so bright I could barely see anything else. I tried to remember how much farther the gas station was. The last sign I saw said it was 5 or 6 miles away, but I wasn't sure how much ground I'd covered since then. I looked at my speedometer again. I was going too fast, but the car behind me showed no signs of slowing down. Then I saw something in the distance, dim light on the horizon. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I got closer, I recognized it. It was the gas station. A few meters ahead, the lights from the sign and the pumps gleamed in the darkness. I could see a small shop next to the pumps, with a car parked off to the side. My heart raced. There was light here. Maybe cameras. Maybe someone working. I turned the steering wheel toward the gas station entrance, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, the lights behind me were gone. I froze for a moment. The car stopped under the bright lights of the station. I looked back several times. The road was empty. The car that had followed me was nowhere to be seen. I slowly got out, my legs shaking. The cool night air felt strange against my warm skin. I walked to the back of my car to inspect the bumper. There was no visible damage, maybe just a small scratch. I looked around. Nothing. No signs of another car or movement on the road. The shop was closed, though the lights inside were still on. I stood there, staring at the road. Just darkness. Eventually, I got back into my car and waited a little longer. I started the engine and decided to continue on. I never saw those headlights again, but even now, that feeling of being watched and chased is etched in my memory. The sound of that bump on my bumper and those blinding lights behind me will never truly fade.